I drove out to the cabin later than I had planned, the sun already dropping lower than I wanted by the time I left the paved road. The gravel drive stretched on longer than I remembered, winding through thick trees that seemed to crowd in closer with every turn. The last light flickered through the branches, breaking into uneven shadows across the hood of my truck. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the air had already cooled, and the woods had that heavy silence that only comes when the day is almost gone. The cabin was small, no more than 2 rooms, with weathered boards on the outside and a tin roof that looked like it had been patched more than once. It sat at the edge of the clearing, backed by a thick wall of trees that went on for miles. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I shut the engine off and sat for a moment before getting out, letting the quiet press in around me. No cars, no people, no voices, just the faint rustle of branches moving against each other. I unloaded what I had brought: a cooler, a sleeping bag, some basic food, and a small box of tools. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was just somewhere I could stay for a few nights, away from everything, a place I hadn't been in years but remembered well enough. The lock was stiff, but it gave when I pushed the door hard. Inside smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like old fabric that had been closed up too long. I set my things down on the small table near the door and opened the windows to air it out. The air that came in was cool and sharp, smelling fresher than anything I'd breathed in months. I could see the tree line from the window, the dark trunks lined up like guards, and beyond them only more layers of forest. The clearing around the cabin was maybe 20 yards across, enough space to see anyone or anything approaching, but it still felt close, hemmed in. By the time I unpacked and set things in place, the light was almost gone. The cabin had no electricity, just a lantern I had brought and a few candles I found in a drawer. The flickering light gave the walls an uneven glow. The floor creaked under me, dry boards shifting slightly with each step. I checked the old wood stove in the corner and found some logs stacked nearby, gray and dry but still good enough to burn. I lit a fire, and the warmth slowly spread, mixing with the faint smell of smoke. That first night passed quietly. I lay on the cot in the corner, listening to the forest outside. I could hear small movements now and then, a branch snapping, something moving through leaves, the long, distant call of what might have been an owl. I had grown up camping and knew the usual sounds of the woods at night. But alone, inside the cabin, every noise seemed sharper. My mind picked at each one, wondering what had made it, how far away it was, and if it was coming closer. I slept, but not deeply. Each time I stirred, I listened for something out of place. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone, making harmless sounds seem heavy with meaning. I reminded myself of that more than once. The next day, I decided to walk the tree line and check the area. The morning was cold, the grass damp with dew, the sunlight sharp and white. The cabin looked smaller from outside, almost fragile against the heavy trees. I walked slow, scanning the ground. I saw old tire tracks near where I had parked, faint and nearly washed away, maybe from hunters or loggers months ago. A few deer prints in the softer dirt. Nothing strange. Still, I kept circling until I reached the back, where the ground sloped down into a thicker patch of trees. That's where I noticed it. A small piece of cloth caught on a branch, dull brown, weathered and torn. It didn't look like it belonged to an animal. It looked like part of a jacket. I pulled it free and turned it in my hand. It had been there a while, the edges stiff and dirty. I slid it into my pocket and kept walking. The rest of the day I tried to keep busy. I cut some wood, swept out the cabin, and cooked a simple meal over the stove. The cloth stayed on my mind though. I hadn't expected to find anything man-made out there. The land was supposed to be empty for miles. That night was harder. The sounds seemed closer. Around midnight, I woke to the faint crunch of something on the gravel outside. I held still, listening. Came again, slow, deliberate, like a footstep. My mouth felt dry, and every muscle in me tensed. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They stopped near the cabin, then nothing, just silence pressing in. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the door, the lantern out, the faint glow of the dying fire throwing weak light across the floor. My ears strained for every shift in the air. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The gravel showed faint marks, but I couldn't be sure what had made them. They could have been footprints, but the light and scattered stones made it hard to tell. I walked the clearing twice, scanning the edge of the trees, but found nothing else. By the third night, my nerves were raw. Every sound outside set me on edge. I double-checked the door, pushed furniture against it, and kept my lantern close. Around 2 a.m, I heard it again. This time, the steps came from the side of the cabin. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't move. The steps circled, paused near the back window, then went silent again. I sat there until dawn, gripping the handle of the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. When the light came, I checked again. This time I saw them. Clear footprints in the dirt near the back wall. Human, barefoot. The prints were wide and deep, the toes splayed, the heel heavy. Not fresh, but not old either. My stomach turned cold as I counted them. Someone had been out there. Someone without shoes. The rest of that day, I stayed close to the cabin, listening, watching. The woods that had felt quiet before now felt watchful. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was out there, waiting, watching me from between the trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern low and stayed near the window, watching the clearing. Hours passed, the fire crackling softly, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. A shape, low and still, near the edge of the clearing. Not an animal. Too tall, too straight. It didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. I froze, every part of me locked in place. My breath came shallow, my eyes straining. Minutes passed, maybe longer. When I finally blinked, the shape was gone. The clearing was empty again. I knew then I couldn't stay. The cabin that had seemed like a safe retreat now felt like a trap. Whoever was out there knew I was here. They had been coming closer each night, testing, circling, waiting. The next morning, I packed everything fast. My hands shook as I shoved gear into bags, checking the windows every few seconds. The woods were too quiet, like they were holding their breath. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, colder than it should have been for morning. I carried everything to the truck in 2 trips, forcing myself not to run. Before I left, I looked once more at the cabin. The door, the windows, the small clearing. It had felt like a refuge when I arrived, but now it looked different. Smaller, weaker, like it had been marked. On the edge of the clearing, near the trees, I saw fresh prints in the dirt, barefoot again, pointing toward the cabin. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel spit from the tires as I pulled away, the trees swallowing the cabin behind me. I didn't stop until the paved road was under me again, the woods far back in the mirror. I never went back. Even now, years later, I still think about those prints. Wide, barefoot, circling me in the night. Whoever it was never showed themselves, never came closer than the edge of the clearing, but they knew I was there. They wanted me to know they were there too, and that was enough. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for weeks. The idea of being away from the constant noise of the city, away from schedules, traffic, and my phone buzzing every few minutes, felt like the only thing I needed to reset my mind. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed by anyone. I wanted that. I wanted silence. The kind of silence you only hear when you're far from roads, far from people, and surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of the wind. The drive to the cabin had already set the tone for what was to come. I had to leave the paved road behind after about an hour outside of the small town where I had stopped for groceries. The dirt road that followed twisted endlessly, with tall pines pressing against both sides of the trail. My tires crunched on gravel, and dust lifted in the mirror behind me. I could feel the remoteness growing with every mile. There was no cell service anymore, just the GPS screen that had cached enough of the map to guide me to the spot. By the time I pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt almost cut off from the rest of the world. The structure looked simple, old, but solid. It was made of dark logs stacked thick, a green metal roof that showed a little rust around the edges, and one small porch with 2 steps. The windows were small, but I liked that. It made the place feel secure, like it was keeping the outside world at a distance. I stepped out of the car and felt the quiet press against me immediately. No hum of engines, no chatter of neighbors, just the faint hiss of wind through the needles of pine trees. The air had that cool sharpness that always seems cleaner in the woods. I carried my bags inside and shut the door behind me, listening to the heavy click of the lock sliding into place. It was just me here, and I liked that. The first hours passed peacefully. I set down the groceries, unpacked, walked through the cabin slowly, noting every detail. The living space had a worn rug spread across the wood floor, a stone fireplace blackened from years of use, and a heavy wooden table pushed near the back wall. The kitchen was small, barely enough room for one person, but stocked with the basics: an old propane stove, a kettle, and mismatched mugs. The bedroom had a single bed pushed against the wall with thick blankets folded neatly on top. There was no electricity other than what the small solar battery provided, but I had brought lanterns and extra fuel. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, just watching the woods darken. The tree line seemed endless, pressing close, shadows thickening until everything blended into black. There was no sound except the occasional rustle of branches. I was aware of every small movement, every snap of a twig. My eyes searched the darkness, but nothing came forward. When it grew too dark to see anything clearly, I went inside, shut the door, and locked it again. The first night was restless. The silence that I had craved now pressed down on me in a way that made it hard to sleep. In the city, there's always some noise. A car in the distance, a voice drifting up from the street, the hum of appliances. But here there was nothing. Nothing except the small creaks of the cabin itself as the wood shifted in the cool air. Every sound seemed sharper, more important. At some point, I drifted off. The next morning, I decided to walk around the area, get a feel for the land around the cabin. I followed a narrow path that led away from the clearing and into the trees. The forest was dense, with moss crawling up the bases of trunks and fallen branches soft underfoot. I walked for maybe an hour, careful to remember turns, careful not to stray too far. At one point, I came across a set of footprints in the dirt, boot prints, not animal. They were faint, but fresh enough that they hadn't been washed away by rain or covered by falling needles. That gave me pause. I hadn't seen another house or car on the road in. The listing for the cabin had made it clear that it was private land, far from any neighbors. Still, maybe a hunter had passed through. I tried to shrug it off, but the prints stayed in my mind. When I returned to the cabin, I checked the lock on the door again. I knew it was silly. No one was likely around, and the cabin had probably been empty for weeks before I arrived. But there was something about being alone in a place so remote that made me double-check things I wouldn't normally think twice about. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling of wood and the glow of flames gave the cabin a sense of comfort. I sat close to the fire, reading by lantern light until my eyes grew heavy. I put the book down, doused the lantern, and listened to the fire pop and hiss. Just before sleep, I thought I heard something outside, a soft crunch, like a footstep on gravel. My body froze. I held my breath, listening hard, but after a long stretch of silence, I told myself it must have been the wind dropping a branch or an animal moving through the brush. I eventually fell asleep, though it was uneasy. Over the next 2 days, the sense of peace I had expected was slowly replaced by unease. I noticed small things first. Once, when I came back from gathering firewood, I thought I saw the curtain in the window move slightly, as if it had just settled back into place. Another time, I found the back door, one I hadn't touched since arriving, unlocked. I told myself maybe I had overlooked it when I first walked through, but I was sure I hadn't. The woods themselves began to feel different too. I would step outside and pause, feeling as though the trees were holding their breath with me. Sometimes I felt watched, though whenever I turned there was nothing. Once, walking the trail again, I found another footprint. This time it was clearer, pressed deep into a patch of damp soil. The size of it suggested someone larger than me, maybe heavier. I stood over it for a long time, the hairs on my arms prickling, before turning back the way I had come. Nights were the worst. The silence stretched endlessly, but every so often I heard noises that didn't fit. A crack of wood too close to the cabin. A faint rustling, not like an animal scurrying, but slower, deliberate. Once, I woke in the night certain I had heard something scrape against the side of the cabin wall. I lay still, listening, barely breathing. The sound didn't come again, but I could feel my heart pounding in the dark. On the fifth night, I was almost asleep when I heard it clearly. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. The boards creaked under the weight. I didn't move. My eyes were wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my breath caught in my throat. The steps stopped near the door. I imagined someone standing there, listening just as I was. My mind raced through options, but I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, though it could only have been a few minutes, the sound of steps retreated. First on the porch, then fading into the dirt outside. I barely slept at all. When morning finally came, I checked the porch. The dirt at the bottom of the steps had been disturbed. A clear boot print pressed into the soil. Not mine. I knew without a doubt. Fear settled in then, heavy and constant. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there, and they knew I was here. The cabin that had felt secure now felt like a trap. I checked the windows, the locks, every corner of the cabin. I made sure the axe I had been using for firewood was inside now, leaning near the bed. I kept it close. That evening, I sat in the dark without lighting the lantern, hoping that if anyone was watching, they might think I wasn't inside. My ears strained at every sound. The hours stretched painfully slow. At some point, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps in the dirt, moving closer, stopping, starting again. My pulse hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps circled the cabin slowly. Gravel shifting, then silence. Then a scrape against the wood. I gripped the axe handle so tight my hand hurt. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, every nerve screaming. I thought I heard breathing outside the window once, but I couldn't be sure. Then silence again, long and heavy. I stayed like that for hours until finally, sometime deep in the night, exhaustion dragged me under. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully, axe in hand. The ground around the cabin told the story. Footprints circled the building over and over. They were clear, pressed deep, as if whoever had been there had paced the perimeter again and again. I felt sick looking at them. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, tossing things into bags without care. I loaded the car as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I drove out fast, gravel spitting under the tires, my hands tight on the wheel. Every turn of the dirt road, I expected to see someone ahead, standing in the way, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the paved road and the faint bars of cell service flickered back on my phone, I pulled over and just sat there, shaking. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That someone had walked around the cabin? That I had heard footsteps? There was no face, no name, no proof. Just prints in the dirt and nights of terror. I never went back to the cabin. I canceled the rest of my stay and drove straight home. I drove farther than I thought I would that morning. The dirt road twisted through trees that grew taller the deeper I went, their branches hanging low over the narrow track like they wanted to scrape across the top of my truck. The air was cooler than it had been in the town I had passed an hour earlier. My phone had already dropped signal. I didn't think too much about it, since that was what I wanted, to be away from people, away from noise. I had rented a small cabin online, the kind people described as rustic and quiet. I thought that was exactly what I needed, just a few days to myself where nobody could reach me. The cabin was small, one story, with wooden steps leading up to a porch that had 2 chairs and a small table. The paint was chipped on the railing. The roof was covered in needles that had fallen from the pines. I parked on the patch of dirt beside it and carried my bags up. The front door opened with a heavy push, and the smell inside was a mix of wood, dust, and something faintly damp, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It felt heavy, pressing down. Inside, the layout was simple. A small kitchen with an old stove, a fridge that looked like it hummed when it wanted to, a narrow table with 2 chairs. Past that was a small sitting room with a couch and a wood stove in the corner. A short hall led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. The cabin wasn't big enough for anything more. The windows faced the trees on every side. Thick trunks stood only a few yards away, and I couldn't see past them. The forest swallowed everything beyond the first line of trees. No neighbors, no lights, no movement, just stillness. The first day passed without much. I unpacked, stacked some firewood on the porch, and sat on the steps watching the forest turn darker. As night came on, I realized how early it felt compared to the city. The shadows stretched fast, and once the sun dropped behind the trees, the cabin was left in near total blackness. I turned on the single outside light, but it only reached a short circle before fading into nothing. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to relax on the couch. The silence of the forest outside was louder than I thought silence could be. No cars in the distance, no voices, no power lines humming. Nothing. Every time I thought I heard something, it was small, a faint tap or a creak of wood, and it made me sit still and listen harder. My chest stayed tight, like waiting for something that never came. That night, I slept uneasy. The bedroom window faced the woods. I kept the blinds half closed, but I could see the outline of trees against the moonlight. Every gust of wind made them sway, and in the corner of my eye, it looked like shapes moving between them. I told myself it was just the way shadows worked, but I didn't sleep more than a few hours. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went for a walk down the dirt road, not too far, maybe a mile. The forest pressed in on both sides. The road curved, and I lost sight of the cabin quickly. The farther I walked, the more I realized how empty this place was. No houses, no signs, no sounds of people. Just the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional snap of a branch. When I got back, I noticed something that made me stop on the steps. The firewood I had stacked was different. The pile was the same size, but the logs were arranged differently, almost like someone had moved them and put them back. I stared at it for a while, then told myself I must have remembered it wrong. But the thought sat in my head for the rest of the day. By the second night, the noises started. Small things, nothing dramatic. A shuffle outside the cabin, the sound of weight on the porch steps. Then nothing. I sat up in bed, my ears straining in the dark, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. I told myself it was animals. Maybe raccoons, maybe a deer wandering close. The woods were full of life, that's all it was. But I didn't open the blinds to check. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling until dawn finally came. That morning, I found footprints in the dirt by the steps. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The ground was dry, and the prints were faint but clear enough. They weren't small like a child's, and they weren't wide like an animal's. Just human feet. I stood there staring at them, the cold air raising bumps on my arms. I walked around the cabin, checking for more. A few prints circled the back, then disappeared into the trees. No path, no reason. Just wandering close enough to the cabin, then gone. My throat stayed dry for hours after that. I thought about packing up, but I had paid for the place and didn't want to believe something was wrong. I told myself maybe some hiker had gotten lost, maybe they stumbled by and left. The woods played tricks on people. That was the story I forced myself to believe. But the feeling inside me changed. The cabin no longer felt like mine, not even for the few days I had it. It felt like I was being tolerated, watched, like something knew I was there and wanted me to leave. That night, I made sure the door was locked, the windows shut tight. I pushed the small table in front of the door even though it felt ridiculous. I sat with the wood stove burning, listening to every sound outside. The scrape of branches against the siding, the whistle of wind in the chimney, the faint crack of wood under weight. Hours passed like that, me frozen on the couch, waiting for something to happen. It did. Sometime after midnight, there was a slow press on the front steps, with groaning underweight. Then another. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. My throat felt like it closed. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. The steps stopped at the porch, and then I heard the sound of the door handle turning, metal clicking as it twisted against the lock. I stared at the door, every muscle in me tight. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then silence. A long silence that felt worse than the noise. When I finally forced myself to move, I went into the bedroom, grabbed my bag, and started shoving things into it. I couldn't stay another night. Whatever was out there wasn't random. It wasn't a hiker, it wasn't some accident. Someone had been coming closer each night, testing the cabin, testing me. I waited until first light before stepping outside. The air was colder, and I could see my breath. On the porch, there was a smear of dirt across the door near the handle, like a handprint. I didn't stop to look closer. I carried my bag to the truck, threw it in the passenger seat, and started the engine. But when I looked at the road ahead, my stomach dropped. The dirt road was blocked. A tree had fallen across it overnight. Not a small one, but a thick pine that stretched across the whole track. The trunk was clean where it had split, almost too clean. I sat there gripping the steering wheel. To move that tree would take more than one person, and it didn't look like it had fallen on its own. The road was cut off, and I knew there wasn't another way out except miles of walking through forest I didn't know. I backed the truck up, parked it again, and went inside the cabin. I didn't have a choice but to wait and figure something out. I tried the landline on the wall, but it was dead. No dial tone. I searched the drawers for tools, anything that could help, but there was nothing useful. The day dragged. Every shadow outside made me tense. I kept thinking about those bare footprints, about the tree across the road. None of it felt like chance. Someone wanted me stuck there. Night came faster than I wanted. I kept every light on, the wood stove burning, my back against the wall where I could see both the door and the window. Hours passed in silence until I heard movement again. This time it wasn't just on the porch. It was around the cabin, circling slow, footsteps crunching in the dirt, pausing, then moving again. I sat there with sweat dripping down my face even though the room was cold. The steps stopped at the back, near the bedroom window. Then came a sound I'll never forget, the slow drag of fingers across glass. I didn't sleep at all. The steps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, always just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. When daylight came, I checked outside again. More footprints, more hand smears on the windows, always bare hands, bare feet. I didn't think about staying anymore. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed food and water into it, and left on foot. I didn't care about the cabin, about the truck, about the road. I just wanted out. I followed the dirt road past the fallen tree, walking fast, every sound in the woods making me snap my head around. I walked for hours until my legs shook. Finally, I saw another car parked on the side of the road, then a house set back in a clearing. Relief hit so hard I almost fell. I didn't care who lived there. I just needed to be out of the trees. When I finally made it back to town, I didn't look back. I didn't go back for the truck, or my things, or anything I had left behind. The cabin wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never was. I had rented the cabin without much thought. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere cut off, somewhere away from the endless noise of traffic and people. It was early fall when I drove up there, the kind of season when the days were still warm enough to walk outside in a thin shirt, but the nights dropped low, leaving the ground wet with dew and the air smelling sharp with pine. The cabin sat a good 20 minutes off the nearest road, tucked into a dense stretch of forest where the trees pressed close on all sides and the only clearings were carved by hand decades ago. When I first stepped out of the car, I noticed how still it was. Not silent. There was always the faint hum of insects and the occasional caw of a bird, but still in a way that felt heavy. The kind of stillness that sinks into you and makes you notice your own footsteps more than usual. The gravel crunched loud under my boots as I carried my bags inside. The cabin was small, single-story, with a pitched roof and a front porch barely big enough to hold a chair. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faint mildew, but it wasn't unpleasant. The main room had a wood stove, a table, and a sagging couch. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. That was it. No electricity beyond a few bare bulbs powered by a generator out back, and no running water except what came from a holding tank. It was the kind of place where you really felt cut off. Exactly what I thought I wanted. The first night passed without trouble. I cooked on a small propane stove, read by lantern light until my eyes grew tired, then crawled into the squeaky bed. The forest outside was loud with crickets and the occasional rustle in the brush. It was comforting, in a way, knowing life moved just beyond the walls. But the second night, I started to notice things. I had gone out on the porch before bed, standing in the cool night air with a flashlight in my hand. The beam caught the trunks of the trees closest to the cabin, their bark pale and ridged. Beyond that, the light dissolved into blackness. I swept the beam slowly, listening, waiting. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the rhythm of the woods. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not far off. It was the kind of sharp, heavy crack that doesn't happen from a squirrel or a rabbit. Something larger. I froze, listening hard. My light shook a little in my hand as I pointed it toward the sound. But there was nothing, only dark shapes and shadows. I waited, maybe a minute or two, ears straining. Then another sound came, a crunch, the kind of crunch made by weight on dried leaves. I told myself it could be a deer. Plenty of deer lived in these woods. Or maybe a bear moving through, though that thought made my stomach tighten. I backed slowly inside, locked the door even though I knew it was flimsy, and tried to settle in for the night. But my sleep was shallow, broken by the slightest noise. I thought I heard faint steps outside at one point, circling. But each time I sat up and strained to listen, there was nothing but silence pressing in. The next morning, I went out to check. The ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves, so I didn't expect clear tracks, but near the side of the cabin, I found a spot where the brush looked disturbed. A few branches bent down, leaves broken. Something had moved through there. My chest tightened as I crouched, brushing my hand across the ground. No paw prints, no hoof marks, nothing I could identify, just disturbance like someone had passed through deliberately. I spent that day trying to distract myself, walking a short trail nearby, chopping some firewood, cleaning up inside. But the thought kept coming back. If it was an animal, why did it come so close to the cabin? Why had it circled? I told myself I was letting my imagination run too far. People lived in places like this all the time. I wasn't in any danger. But by the third night, things grew worse. Started just after midnight. I woke up for no reason, my chest already tight as though some part of me sensed it. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it, a slow, steady crunch of leaves outside the window. Not hurried, not the kind of random scurry animals made. This was paced, measured, like footsteps. The cabin's bedroom window faced the woods only 10 feet away. The curtains were thin, barely blocking light. I could see the outline of trees against the moonlit sky through the fabric. I didn't move, not at first. I just listened. The crunching grew closer. Then it stopped, dead silent. I waited. My heartbeat hammered so loud I thought it would give me away. Then came the faintest scrape, like something brushing against the wall of the cabin. Just once. A drag of wood against wood. I slid slowly out of bed, my bare feet on the cold floorboards, and reached for the flashlight I had kept on the table. My hand shook so bad I nearly dropped it. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam at the window. The curtain glowed white but showed nothing behind it. I stood frozen for minutes, light in hand, until finally the sounds faded. When morning came, I checked again outside. This time I found it. A mark on the wall below the window. A long, thin scrape running downward. Not deep, but fresh. It hadn't been there before. My throat went dry as I ran my finger along it. That wasn't an animal. That was something or someone dragging something against the wall. The rest of the day, I kept hearing faint noises in the trees. A crack here, a rustle there. Every time I spun to look, there was nothing but still forest. I told myself I should pack up, leave early, just go. But a part of me resisted. I had come here to be alone, to face quiet. If I left now, it felt like I was giving in to nothing but my nerves. That night, I made a mistake. I left the lantern on inside while I sat at the table. The curtains on the windows were thin, and I realized too late that from outside, anyone could see clear silhouettes of me moving around. The thought made my skin crawl. I quickly doused the light, sitting in darkness, but by then it was too late. An hour later, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slow and deliberate around the porch. The wood creaked under weight. Someone was up there, right outside the door. My throat locked as I sat rigid on the couch, not daring to breathe. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. Metal rattling. The door handle. Slowly, testing it. I gripped the flashlight, ready to swing if the door opened. But the lock held. After a long moment, the rattling stopped. Silence pressed back in, heavier than before. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came, I stepped out to check the porch. The dirt near the steps showed faint impressions, boot prints, clear as day. Large, heavy boot prints leading up to the cabin and circling back into the woods. My stomach sank like a stone. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't animals. Someone had been out there, watching, testing the door. I packed my things fast, my hands shaking so bad I dropped my bag twice. I loaded the car, eyes darting to the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods looked empty, just rows of trunks and shifting shadows. I drove down the dirt road without looking back, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. Every turn in the road felt like something would be waiting around it. Only when I reached the paved highway did I finally feel air rush back into my lungs. That night, I checked into a cheap roadside motel, the kind with buzzing neon and thin walls. I didn't care. I locked the door, drew the curtains tight, and sat on the bed shaking. My mind replayed the scrape on the wall, the boots on the porch, the rattle of the handle. I never went back for the rest of my rental. I called the company, told them there were safety concerns, and left it at that. They didn't ask for details, and I didn't give them. To this day, I don't know who it was out there or what they wanted. All I know is this: if I had been less careful with that lock or slower waking up, or if I had ignored that first sound outside, the ending could have been far worse. The cabin gave me the silence I thought I wanted, but it also showed me the truth about being alone out there. You aren't ever really alone, and sometimes whoever else is out there isn't looking to stay hidden forever. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted a place far from noise, far from city streets, and far from the endless routine that had been wearing me down. I found a small wooden cabin listed online. It was old, but it sat alone deep inside a forest, far enough from the nearest town that I would not hear anything except the trees and the wind. The photos showed a simple wooden deck, a slanted tin roof, and a single window facing a clearing. It looked quiet, peaceful, the kind of place I thought would let me breathe again. The drive up took hours. The road narrowed the further I went, turning from pavement into gravel, and then from gravel into a dirt path full of rocks and dips. By the time I finally saw the cabin, my tires had been crunching through dry leaves and fallen branches for miles. The sun was lowering in the sky, painting everything with orange light. The cabin looked even smaller in person than it had online. It sat at the edge of the clearing, trees crowding around the back and sides, as if they were trying to reclaim it. I parked the car near the front steps and turned off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there with the windows rolled down, letting the silence sink in. It wasn't really silent, though. I could hear insects, faint rustles from birds moving through the brush, the low groan of wood as the cabin settled. But compared to the city, it was silence. I could feel my chest ease. Inside, the place smelled like old pine mixed with dust. There was a small main room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a sagging couch with faded cushions. A narrow doorway led into a small bedroom with a single bed pushed against the wall. The sheets were clean but stiff, probably unused for months. A small bathroom was tucked behind it, barely big enough for a sink, a toilet, and a cracked mirror hanging from a nail. There was no shower, only a spout outside connected to a water tank. I unpacked slowly, setting my food and water jugs on the counter, stacking firewood beside the stove, and placing my flashlight and knife on the table. I had planned for this. I had read about people getting caught unprepared in remote cabins, so I brought enough supplies to last a week. My phone had no service, which I had expected, so I left it powered down to save battery. By the time I was done, the sky had darkened to deep blue. I lit a lantern and set it on the table. The warm glow made the small room feel safer, like I had carved out a bubble of light against the pressing darkness outside. I made myself a simple meal of canned beans and bread, then sat on the porch steps to eat. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and damp as the night settled in. I could see my breath faintly in the light of the lantern behind me. The woods were a black wall. I listened. The insects were still buzzing, but I noticed something else. A faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking under weight, came from the trees not far from the clearing. I froze with my spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound stopped. I waited, staring into the dark. Maybe it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of animals, and they broke branches all the time. Still, I found myself standing up, scanning the shadows, my heart beating harder than it should have. After a few minutes of nothing, I forced myself to finish eating. I told myself it was only nerves, adjusting to the isolation. When I finally went inside and bolted the door, I pushed the sound to the back of my mind. That night, sleep did not come easily. The mattress was lumpy and smelled faintly of mildew, but what kept me awake were the noises. I heard creaks outside, faint steps in the leaves, the brush of something against the wall. Each time, I held my breath and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, just wind or animals. Eventually, sometime after midnight, exhaustion dragged me down. The morning light broke through the single-bedroom window. I woke stiff and uneasy, but nothing seemed out of place. I walked the clearing, scanning the ground. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then, near the edge of the trees, I found it. A footprint. It was pressed into the soft earth, larger than my own, the tread of a heavy boot clear in the mud. I crouched, staring at it, trying to measure the size with my hand. Someone had been standing there, close enough to see the cabin. I straightened and turned slowly, searching the woods, but they were still and quiet. I told myself maybe it was an old print, left weeks ago by a hunter or hiker, but the edges were sharp. The rain from a few nights earlier had washed the ground clean. This was new. Someone had been there last night, watching. The rest of the day I kept myself busy. I chopped kindling, stacked wood, boiled water for coffee. But every few minutes I found myself glancing at the tree line, scanning for movement. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just trees and shadows. It was cover. It was places for someone to hide. That night, I couldn't bring myself to eat outside. I stayed in the cabin with the door bolted, listening to the fire pop in the stove. I ate in silence, every sense tuned to the woods. Hours passed. Then, sometime close to midnight, I heard it again. A slow crunch of leaves. A pause. Then another. Someone was walking the perimeter of the clearing. I held my breath, every muscle tight. The steps circled, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My lantern flickered, shadows jumping across the walls. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. Then silence. I sat frozen for what felt like an hour, but eventually the quiet stretched long enough that I convinced myself they were gone. I lay down on the bed, though sleep never really came. Every sound felt sharp, every creak of the cabin a warning. By morning, I decided I had to check. I walked the clearing again, this time further into the trees. That's when I found more. Fresh boot prints, circling the cabin, stopping near the porch steps, then turning away. Someone had come close, too close. I felt my stomach tighten. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in. Not yet. They were just watching, studying. The next nights grew worse. Each time, the steps came back, always after dark. Sometimes circling, sometimes stopping for long minutes in one spot. as if the person was standing there, staring at the cabin. I started to hear breathing, faint but real, carried through the cracks in the window frame. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back down the dirt road, but the thought of trying to get the car through miles of rough forest road in the dark felt worse. If they wanted me gone, maybe they'd be waiting. I decided to stay, but I didn't sleep. I stayed awake with the lantern burning low, knife in hand, listening. I started to barricade the door with furniture, dragging the table and chairs against it each night. I nailed blankets over the windows to block any view inside. My world shrank to the small pool of light around the stove, and even that felt exposed. On the fourth night, I heard the porch steps creak. Slow, careful, one at a time. My blood went cold. I gripped the knife so hard my hand shook. The steps stopped right at the door. I could hear the faint sound of weight shifting on the boards. Minutes passed. Then the handle rattled. Not hard, not like they were trying to break it, just a slow test, as if they were checking to see if it was locked. I held my breath until my chest ached. Finally, the sound stopped. The steps retreated. The woods swallowed them again. By morning, I had made my choice. I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bags, loading the car with trembling hands. I didn't care if I left supplies behind. I just wanted out. But when I turned the key, the engine coughed once and died. I tried again. Nothing. I lifted the hood, but I'm no mechanic. What I did notice was the fuel line, cut clean through. Someone had done it while I was inside, trapped me here. Panic set in. My only option was the road. If I followed it long enough, I would reach the main highway. But it was miles, maybe 10 or more. I gathered what I could carry: water, some food, my knife, and locked the cabin behind me, though I knew it meant nothing. The road stretched empty, trees closing in on both sides. My boots crunched on the gravel, each step loud in the stillness. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone following. For hours I walked, the sun rising high and then beginning to dip again. My legs ached, my throat dry despite the water. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the bend of the road ahead. Too far to see details, but close enough to know it was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered. He didn't move. He just stood, blocking the way. I stopped. My mind raced. I thought about running into the woods, but I didn't know the land. And if he did, he could circle and cut me off. My hand tightened around the knife, though I knew it was useless against someone that size. Then, as if he had made his point, the man stepped slowly back into the trees and vanished. I waited, heart pounding, then forced myself forward, passing the spot where he had stood. I had been driving for hours before I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The day had started early for me, packing up my things and making sure I had enough supplies to last for at least a week. I had been looking forward to this break for months. The cabin was old, one I had rented from a friend of a friend, and it was deep in the woods, far away from the noise of towns, far away from anyone. That was the main reason I picked it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone for a while. The sun was still up when I parked my truck outside the cabin. It wasn't much to look at. The logs were weathered, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked as soon as I stepped on it. The air smelled of damp pine and soil, and there was a heaviness to it that I noticed right away. No cars passed by. No dogs barked in the distance. It was silent in a way I wasn't used to. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was bare bones, just what you'd expect from a place that hadn't been lived in regularly. A single room with a kitchen on one side, a small table, a couch that had seen better days, and a fireplace with ashes still in it. The bedroom was small, just big enough for a bed and a nightstand. The bathroom was at the back, and it smelled faintly of mildew when I opened the door. I set down my bag and went about opening windows to let some air in. The first night felt normal enough. I made a simple meal, walked around the clearing outside the cabin, and watched the sky darken. The silence grew heavier with the night. I realized just how cut off I was. No phone signal, no electricity besides the old generator outside, and no other houses in sight. When I lay down in bed, I heard the woods more clearly than I ever had before. The sound of crickets, the distant snap of branches, the wind moving through trees. It was all louder somehow when there was no traffic or voices to cover it up. I woke up once in the night because I thought I heard something brush against the porch. It was a faint scrape like wood against wood. I sat up in the dark, listening, my ears straining. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. After a while of nothing else, I lay back down, though it took me longer to fall asleep. The next day was quiet too, but I noticed things I hadn't before. The dirt road that led up to the cabin had tire tracks that didn't look fresh but weren't completely washed away either. The tracks didn't look like my truck's tires. I couldn't tell how long ago they were made, but they seemed to lead right up to the clearing and then stop. I pushed the thought aside and went about my day, chopping some firewood, cooking, reading, and walking through the trees nearby. By the third night, I was more aware of the sounds outside. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed sharper. I sat on the porch after dark, wrapped in a jacket, and just listened. First, I enjoyed it. Then I noticed how often I heard the same kind of sound, like someone stepping carefully, then stopping. It wasn't steady like the wind, and it wasn't as random as a wild animal. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that the silence was just playing tricks on me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like someone was moving through the trees, circling without coming too close. I went inside and locked the door, though the lock was weak and the wood around it felt soft. I left the lamp on and stayed awake longer than I meant to. Every time I started to relax, a sound from outside would jolt me back to alertness. Eventually, exhaustion won and I slept. The next morning, I stepped outside to find footprints near the cabin. They weren't mine. The soil around the porch was soft, and the prints were clear. They weren't boots like mine. They looked like worn-down sneakers, the tread barely visible. My chest tightened when I realized they went around the cabin in a full circle. Someone had been out there in the night, walking slowly around while I was inside. I spent the rest of the day tense, checking the woods every few minutes, listening harder than before. I carried the small hatchet with me even when I was just sitting on the porch. Every sound felt closer now, every movement heavier. That night, I barely slept. I heard the scrape again, the same as the first night, something brushing against the porch. Then a faint thud, like weight settling on the wood. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps creaked softly against the boards. Slow, careful. They stopped near the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud enough to be heard. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. I could almost hear them breathing through the thin door. After several long minutes, the boards creaked again, retreating until the sound faded away. In the morning, I found nothing new except for a faint smear on the doorframe, like a dirty hand had brushed against it. The next day, I thought about leaving. I packed some of my things back into my bag, but something in me resisted. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just a hunter or some drifter passing through. I didn't want to be the kind of person who panicked over nothing, so I stayed. The fifth night was the worst. I hadn't run the generator much, trying to save fuel, so the cabin was darker than usual. I lay in bed, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, when I heard the door handle move. Not forcefully, just a slow, testing rattle. The lock clicked softly under the pressure. My mouth went dry, and I sat up as quietly as I could. The handle stopped moving, but then I heard the window frame creak on the other side of the cabin. Someone was testing the windows, moving around the cabin one by one, checking for a weak spot. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the hatchet, my eyes on the windows. When light finally came, I checked outside. More footprints, fresh ones, pressed deep into the soil. Whoever it was had been back closer than before. That day, I made the decision to leave. I packed everything, loaded it into my truck, and started down the dirt road. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. For days afterward, I kept thinking about it. The sound of the steps on the porch, the way the door handle moved, the handprint on the frame. I knew someone had been out there watching, waiting, testing. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew if I had stayed one more night, they might have tried harder to get in. The cabin had felt like a safe retreat at first, but by the end, it was nothing more than a trap. Even now, when I'm in my own house in the city, I sometimes wake up at night and think I hear the porch creak. My mind goes back to that weak lock, the dirty handprint, the sneakers in the soil. I remind myself I got out before anything worse happened. But I also know that whoever was out there is still somewhere, still moving through the trees, still watching for lights in windows where they don't belong. I had been driving for almost 5 hours when I finally reached the narrow dirt road that led toward the cabin. My shoulders were stiff from sitting so long behind the wheel, and my legs ached each time I pressed the brake or gas pedal. The sun was starting to slip lower in the sky, and I could see the golden light cutting through the tall trees on both sides of the road. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far enough that once I got there, I wouldn't hear the highway or see any other houses. That was the point of going, to get away from everything for a while. I had rented the place online. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a tin roof, a small porch, and thick woods around it. The listing said it was built decades ago but had been kept up well. It had no internet, no television, and no neighbors within miles. That sounded exactly like what I wanted. I told myself a few days alone would clear my head. The dirt road twisted back and forth until it got too narrow for 2 cars to pass. Branches scraped the sides of my car as I eased through. I rolled down the window a little and could hear nothing but insects and the occasional call of a bird. No engines, no people, no music, just silence broken by nature. For a moment, it felt peaceful, but another part of me noticed how cut off I was. If something went wrong, there would be no quick help. I pushed that thought aside and kept going until I saw the roof of the cabin appear between the trees. The place looked even more hidden than in the pictures. The porch steps were slightly crooked, and the wood looked darker from weather and age. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but the woods pressed close all around, thick with brush, roots, and tall trunks that made it feel boxed in. I parked the car near the porch and got out. The air smelled sharp, earthy, and damp, like pine needles and soil after rain. I carried my bags up the steps, unlocked the door with the key that had been mailed to me, and went inside. The air inside was stuffy, but the cabin itself looked solid. The floor was bare wood, with scratches and marks from years of use. A small table sat against one wall, 2 chairs beside it. There was a couch covered with a faded blanket, and in the corner a wood stove with a pile of logs stacked beside it. The bedroom was just a mattress on a wooden frame, and the bathroom was basic, with an old sink and a small shower. Everything had a faint smell of wood and dampness, but it was clean enough. I set my bags down and walked through each room again, looking at the details. Small windows faced the woods on all sides. I noticed how quiet it felt once the door was shut. Even the insects outside seemed muffled by the thick glass and walls. I stood there for a long time, trying to settle into the silence. The first couple of hours were calm. I unpacked, put food in the small fridge, and stacked more logs near the stove just in case the nights got cold. I walked around the cabin outside, checking out the clearing. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking up, and I could see trails leading into the trees, though they weren't marked. The trees were tall enough to block most of the sky, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the woods pressing in. When night came, I built a fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and sat at the table eating while the light faded outside. The cabin grew darker quicker than I expected. I had only brought a couple of lanterns and a flashlight, and I turned them on when the windows became black squares. The fire crackled, and the wood popped now and then. I tried to relax, but every sound outside the walls seemed sharper at night. Twigs snapped, branches shifted, and the wind made the trees creak. I told myself it was just animals moving through the woods. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. I went to bed around midnight. The mattress sagged a little, but I was tired enough to fall asleep quickly. The last thing I remember before drifting off was how black it was outside the window. Not a single light anywhere, just total dark. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. At first I thought it was nothing, but then I realized I had heard something outside. A crunch of leaves, a slow step. I lay completely still, my heart already racing, listening hard. Another sound came, faint but real, like someone moving carefully through the clearing. It didn't sound like an animal bounding or scurrying. It was slower, heavier. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark window. The stove fire had burned down, and the cabin was almost completely dark inside. I strained to hear, and after a minute, I caught it again. A soft step, then another. Whoever or whatever it was moving around the cabin. My throat went dry. I told myself maybe it was a deer, but deer didn't move like that. I had lived near woods long enough to know the sound of hooves compared to footsteps. These were footsteps, human footsteps. I lay there for what felt like an hour, barely breathing. The steps circled once, then faded. Finally, I didn't hear anything at all. I stayed awake until the faintest gray light came through the window. When morning finally arrived, I got up and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal, nothing moved. But near the edge of the trees, in the soft dirt, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A footprint, not a boot tread, not something wide and vague like an animal track. A clear, flat impression of a human shoe. The size looked large, maybe a man's shoe, pressed deep enough that it couldn't be old. It had to have been made during the night. The sight of it shook me. I stood there staring, thinking about how far from the main road I was. Nobody should have been out here. The cabin wasn't near any public trails. Whoever had walked around out here wasn't lost. They had come deliberately. I went back inside, locked the door, and spent most of the day checking the windows, listening and trying to calm down. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter passing through, maybe someone who stumbled on the cabin by chance. But the way the steps had gone slowly around the clearing made it feel wrong, like they had been watching. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept the lantern on, sat in the chair by the stove, and listened to every sound outside. Around midnight I heard it again. Faint step, then another, the same slow pattern. My stomach tightened, and I gripped the flashlight in my hand, waiting. The steps came closer this time, almost to the porch. Then silence. For nearly half an hour, nothing moved. I sat frozen, barely blinking. When the noise came again, it was right against the wall. A scrape, like someone brushing a hand or shoulder against the wood. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I stared at the front door, half expecting the handle to turn. But it never did. Whoever it was stayed outside. When the morning came again, I went out and looked around. More footprints, clearer this time, circling the cabin, stopping near the porch steps, then moving away. The prints weren't mine. They were larger, deeper. Someone had been there again, walking while I sat awake inside. By the third night, I knew it wasn't random. Whoever it was kept coming back. They never tried the door, never spoke, never made themselves seen. Just circling, watching, waiting. Each day I debated leaving, but the cabin was deep in the woods, and driving that dirt road at night felt worse. I kept telling myself maybe it would stop, but it didn't. Each night the steps returned. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Sometimes nothing for an hour, then suddenly right against the wall again. I couldn't rest. I barely ate. My mind spun with questions I couldn't answer. By the fifth night, I was so worn down I could barely think. My hands shook when I lit the lantern. I stayed awake again, sitting by the door with a heavy piece of firewood in my lap, ready to use it if I had to. The silence pressed in. Then the steps started. Slow, steady, moving around the cabin. They stopped at the back wall this time, near the bedroom. Then silence. For nearly an hour, nothing. Then I heard the faintest sound, the window frame shifting, just slightly, like pressure against it. Not enough to open, but enough to test it. My stomach turned cold. Whoever it was wasn't just circling anymore. They were trying. I sat gripping the wood, my arms locked, waiting. The sound stopped after a while, but I never slept. By morning, I had made my choice. I couldn't stay. I packed my bags as quickly as I could, stuffed everything in the car, and didn't even bother to clean up. I checked the clearing one last time, and I saw them, fresh footprints pressed deep, leading away into the trees. Whoever had been out there had left not long before sunrise. I drove fast down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides of the car, heart pounding until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking the mirror. When I finally reached town hours later, I stopped at a gas station, sat in the car, and just breathed. The relief felt heavy, but so did the fear. I realized I would never know who had been out there or why. Maybe it was just some stranger passing through. Maybe someone who knew the cabin was usually empty. Or maybe someone who wanted me to open the door one night, too tired to think straight. I drove up into the mountains late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low behind the trees. I had rented a small cabin for a week, hoping to get away from everything. I had been tired from work and from the noise of the city, and the thought of being alone in the woods sounded peaceful. The cabin sat about a mile down a dirt road that turned off from the main mountain highway. The road was narrow and rough, with deep grooves where rain had washed the dirt away. My old SUV bounced and rattled as I followed the winding track through tall pines that pressed close on both sides. When I reached the cabin, the place looked simple and small. It had a wooden porch with 2 steps, a pitched roof, and a chimney made of stone. The windows were old but had shutters. Around the cabin, the trees grew thick, their branches leaning over the roof as if they were trying to hide it. The yard was only a clearing about 20 feet wide, and then the forest swallowed everything. I parked near the porch, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment, just listening. The silence was so deep it felt heavy. There was no traffic, no voices, not even the faint hum of electricity from power lines. Only the rustle of leaves in the wind and the sound of my own breathing. I carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, smoke, and a little dampness, like it had been shut up for a long time. There was one main room with a couch, a chair, and a stone fireplace. A small kitchen sat to the side with a fridge, stove, and sink. In the back was a single bedroom with a bed and a dresser. The bathroom was small with just a toilet, sink, and shower. The lights worked, but the cabin ran on a generator that hummed low outside. The owner had warned me not to leave too many things running at once. After unpacking, I stepped out onto the porch as the last light drained from the sky. The trees turned into black shapes, and the woods around me seemed to close in tighter. I heard crickets, and somewhere in the distance, the sharp call of a bird that echoed off the hills. The air felt colder than in the city, and the smell of pine needles was sharp and clean. For a while, I just stood there, looking into the dark woods, and a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like unease, as if the silence was watching me. I went inside, locked the door, and made something simple to eat. I turned on the small television the cabin had, but there were no channels, only static. I switched it off, leaving the room dim except for the soft yellow light of a lamp. I tried to read a book I had brought, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside. Not close, but faint snaps and crunches, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, but my mind wouldn't let it go. By the time I went to bed, my nerves were tight. That first night, I slept light. The wind rose and made the trees groan and scrape against each other. I woke up more than once, listening to the creaks of the cabin and the shifting of the woods. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that froze me in bed. It was the crunch of gravel, slow and heavy, as if someone was walking across the small clearing outside. My SUV sat on that gravel. The porch steps sat on it. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped. Then there was nothing, only the thudding of my heart. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, that it was just the wind or some branch falling. Still, I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, until I finally drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to believe everything was fine. In the daylight, the woods looked calm and beautiful. I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. My SUV was where I had left it. The ground was scattered with pine needles and old leaves. But when I walked to the edge of the gravel near the porch, I saw something that made me stop. There were marks in the dirt, faint but clear. They looked like shoe prints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, just regular sneakers, pressed into the soft earth. They weren't mine. I stared at them for a long time. The prints came from the woods, cut across the clearing near the porch, and disappeared back into the trees on the other side. Whoever made them had walked close to the cabin. Too close. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could have been anyone. Maybe someone hiking through, maybe the owner checking the place before I arrived. Maybe even older prints I just hadn't noticed before. But the edges looked sharp, not washed out by rain or time. They looked fresh. That day, I couldn't relax. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I walked to the end of the dirt road, just to see if there were other cabins or signs of people nearby. There weren't. The road ended in thick forest. The closest neighbor, the owner had said, was more than 2 miles away. When night came, I felt dread building in me. I cooked dinner, locked the doors, and double-checked the windows. I even pushed a chair against the front door. The silence felt heavier than before, pressing in on the cabin until it was hard to breathe. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound again, crunching on the gravel. Slow, careful, deliberate. This time, there was no denying it. Someone was outside. My chest tightened as I lay frozen in bed. The sound moved around the cabin, one step at a time. Gravel, then dirt, then the soft scrape of a foot against wood. The porch. I gripped the blanket in my fists, afraid to move. The floorboards outside the bedroom creaked faintly, though I told myself it was just my mind filling in what I couldn't hear. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I lay awake until dawn, eyes burning, heart never slowing. In the morning, I checked again. More prints in the dirt, clearer this time. They came right up to the porch steps, then turned away. The rest of the week turned into a blur of fear and exhaustion. Every day I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving that rough dirt road at night felt worse. In the daylight, I convinced myself I could make it through. At night, when the sounds returned, I regretted staying. Each night, the steps came closer, circling the cabin. Sometimes they stopped for long stretches, as if whoever it was stood still, waiting. Once, I heard the faint squeak of the door handle turning, slow and testing. The chair against the door rattled softly. I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. I ate little. I stopped going outside except in daylight, and even then, I carried the heavy iron poker from the fireplace in my hand. The woods no longer looked peaceful. They looked endless and hostile, every shadow hiding someone who wanted to get closer. On the 5th night, everything changed. I was sitting on the couch, too tired to even read, when I heard it, wood breaking, sharp and loud. Not from the porch this time, but from the back of the cabin. I froze. Then came the sound of something forcing against the back door. Hard, steady pressure like a shoulder slamming into it. I grabbed the poker and stood in the middle of the room, shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The door groaned. The lock rattled. For a moment, I thought it was going to burst open. Then silence. I stood there for minutes, not moving, barely breathing. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the back door was still shut, but the frame was cracked near the lock. Whoever it was had been inches from getting in. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the poker across my lap, every muscle tight, waiting for another sound. None came, but I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, loading my bags into the SUV. As I carried the last one out, I glanced at the trees. In the shadows between the trunks, I thought I saw movement. Figure still and watching. My stomach dropped. I got into the SUV, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I turned and sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway and saw other cars. When I finally reached the city, the noise and lights felt like safety. But even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. The shoe prints, The crunch of gravel in the dark. The hand on the door handle. Someone was out there in those woods, circling that cabin night after night. Someone who wanted to get inside. I never found out who it was. I never went back, and I never will. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything for months. Work had drained me. City noise never stopped, and my head felt like it was filled with a constant buzzing. When a friend mentioned that his uncle had an old cabin up in the woods that was rarely used, I jumped at the chance to take it for a few days. It was supposed to be peaceful, remote, and quiet enough for me to reset. I thought being alone in a cabin would be nothing but rest, reading, and maybe a few walks through the forest. The drive itself took almost 5 hours. At first, the roads were wide, clean, and full of signs, but as I got closer, the path became more narrow, broken, and rough. The asphalt gave way to gravel and then dirt. Trees leaned close from both sides, their branches almost touching over my car like they were trying to shut me in. I drove slowly because my small car wasn't made for these roads. Every rock I hit felt like it rattled my bones. There were no houses, no gas stations, no signs of life anymore. Just endless walls of trees, broken now and then by small open patches of dry grass. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because I had made it without my car giving up. Unease because of how alone it was. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail that broke off from the dirt road. The trail was barely wide enough for my car. The cabin itself was small, with wood that looked old and weathered. The roof sagged slightly on one side, the porch boards were gray, and the windows had a dusty film on them. Still, it stood upright, and that was all I needed. I parked next to it and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavier than I expected. In the city, silence doesn't really exist. There is always something. Traffic in the distance, voices, sirens, music. Out here, there was nothing but the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird I didn't recognize. It felt so empty that it made me nervous. I unlocked the cabin with the key my friend had given me. The door stuck for a moment before it groaned open. Inside, the air was stale, like the place hadn't been opened in months. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight that broke through gaps in the curtains. The cabin had only one main room with a small kitchen space on the side, and a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. It was basic, old wooden furniture, a couch that sagged, a few shelves with books, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I set down my bag and started to settle in. I checked the kitchen and found a small supply of canned goods and bottled water, just like my friend had told me. I had brought extra food anyway. I opened the windows to let fresh air in, and after a while, the place felt less stale. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, walked around the clearing outside, and sat on the porch with a book. The forest was thick, stretching out endlessly in every direction. The trees were tall and close together, their shadows deep. I couldn't hear anything beyond the occasional bird or the wind moving through branches. No cars, no planes, no people. At first it was nice, but the longer I sat, the more I noticed the weight of that silence. When night came, the forest changed. The air grew colder quickly, and the light faded fast behind the trees. I lit a lantern and some candles since the cabin didn't have working electricity. I ate a simple meal and tried to read, but my focus kept breaking. Every small sound outside drew my attention. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, something scurrying through the brush. In the city, those noises don't mean much, but out here, every sound carried weight. I reminded myself it was just animals, but my nerves didn't fully settle. When I finally went to bed, the cabin's walls felt thinner. The bed was old but sturdy, and I lay there in the dark listening to the forest. I thought sleep would come fast after the long drive, but I lay awake longer than I expected. The noises outside seemed louder in the stillness of night. Something moved around the clearing, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons. Sometime after midnight, I heard something different, a dull thud, like something heavy hitting wood. I froze in bed, ears straining. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. It was the porch. I was sure of it. I held my breath, listening hard. The thud stopped, and I lay there in silence for what felt like hours until exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke the next morning, the unease from the night before seemed almost silly. The forest looked harmless in the daylight. I stepped outside and checked the porch. The boards looked the same, but near the steps, I noticed something faint in the dirt. Imprints. Not shoes, not clear, but something pressed into the soil. They were wide and uneven, like heavy boots or maybe just random shapes left by animals. I stared at them for a while, my stomach twisting, before brushing it off as nothing. I spent the day hiking around the area. The trails weren't marked, but I stayed close enough to the cabin not to get lost. The forest was dense, and sunlight barely reached the ground. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds stopped making noise. After a while, I turned back, uneasy with how easy it would be to get turned around in those woods. That night, the sounds returned. More footsteps, slow and dragging, circling the cabin. I lay in bed stiff, gripping the blanket. The steps would stop, then start again, sometimes on the porch, sometimes near the windows. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. At one point, I heard the sound of something brushing against the wall outside, like fingers or branches scraping wood. The sound continued for what felt like hours until finally, silence returned. In the morning, I forced myself outside again. I checked around the cabin and found more prints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They looked too big, too heavy. Human, maybe. My mouth went dry as I stared at them. I felt exposed standing there, like someone could be watching me from the trees. I kept telling myself it had to be hunters, hikers, maybe someone wandering by. But the cabin was miles off the main road, deep in the woods. No one just wandered here. The third night was worse. The noises started earlier, before I even got into bed. I sat on the couch, lantern lit, listening. Something moved slowly around the cabin, circling again and again. I heard the porch creak under weight. I heard the doorknob rattle gently, like someone was testing it. My whole body went cold. I stayed completely still, clutching a kitchen knife I had taken from the drawer. The rattling stopped, but then came a long, slow scrape across the door. Metal on wood. My throat tightened as the sound dragged out, high and sharp, before stopping. I wanted to shout, to run, but I forced myself not to make a sound. After a long time, the noise faded, and I sat there until dawn, too scared to move. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was out there wasn't going away. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my bag. When I stepped outside to load the car, I froze. On the porch, carved deep into one of the wooden posts, was a mark. A long vertical cut with smaller slashes crossing it, like someone had deliberately carved a symbol. My stomach dropped. That wasn't random. Someone had been here, close enough to leave that mark without me noticing. I shoved my bag into the car and started the engine. The road out felt longer than the road in. Every shadow between the trees made me think of someone standing there, watching me. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they hurt. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me so strong I almost cried. I never told my friend what happened. I just said the cabin was fine, a little old, but fine. I didn't want to explain the sounds, the prints, the carvings. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I had opened the door one of those nights. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know it was real. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left that cabin at all. I had been looking forward to getting away from everything for a while. The last few months had been filled with noise, stress, and endless movement, and I wanted to be somewhere silent. I had booked a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the main roads, far from towns, and far from people. I didn't want neighbors or cars passing by. I wanted trees, cold air, and stillness. I drove for hours through winding roads, with my cell phone losing service halfway through the trip. That was expected. I had been warned ahead of time that the cabin was isolated and not covered by any network. The owner had told me that there was no landline either, but there was a small emergency radio inside, just in case. When I reached the small dirt road that led to the cabin, I already felt the world shrinking down around me. The forest grew thicker and darker the deeper I went. I could see no other buildings, no cabins, no signs of people. The gravel cracked under the tires of my car as I climbed up the rough road, which was narrow and winding, almost like it was forcing me to be careful. Branches leaned over the top of the car, and the sun disappeared behind the canopy, leaving only scattered beams of light through the gaps. By the time I reached the cabin, the quietness was heavy. The place itself was small, made of dark wood, with a metal roof that looked older than I thought it would be. It had a porch with 2 wooden chairs that faced the trees. Behind the cabin, the slope dropped into a dense wall of forest that seemed endless. There was no one for miles, and standing there made that very clear. I carried my bags inside and noticed right away how the inside smelled faintly of damp wood, mixed with something like old smoke from the fireplace. The cabin had one main room with a bed against the wall, a small kitchen area, and a table with 2 chairs. A fireplace stood on the far side, with a pile of wood stacked neatly in a rack beside it. There was a small bathroom, nothing more than a shower and a toilet. No TV, no phone, no computer, just silence. At first, it was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked slowly, then walked around the property to take in where I would be spending the next few nights. There was a trail behind the cabin that seemed to snake deeper into the forest, but I didn't plan to go too far without proper gear. I wanted to just stay near the cabin, read my book, make food, and breathe in the fresh air. The first evening went quietly. I cooked a simple meal, read on the porch until the sun started to drop, and then lit the fireplace. The temperature dropped sharply after dark, and the warmth of the fire was comforting. The woods outside became nothing but blackness once the sun was gone. No streetlights, no houses, no glow from any nearby town. Just absolute darkness pressing against the windows. I didn't mind at first, but I noticed that I kept looking at the window glass. My own reflection was there, faint, surrounded by black. I couldn't see what was outside, but I kept staring as though expecting something to appear. That first night, I slept deeply, though the silence was strange. No cars, no hum of appliances, nothing but the occasional snap of a branch somewhere outside. The second day, I woke up early and walked a bit on the trail behind the cabin. The forest was beautiful in the morning, filled with damp smells of earth and pine, but I noticed how quickly the trees seemed to swallow sound. Only a few steps away from the cabin, and the world became muffled. I couldn't even hear the wind clearly, just the crunch of my own boots. I walked for maybe 20 minutes before deciding to turn back. I didn't want to lose the trail. Back at the cabin, I cooked, cleaned up, and tried to relax. The hours stretched in a strange way. Without internet, without calls, time felt heavier, slower. I sat on the porch for long stretches, just listening. But listening also made me aware of how many small noises there were. Things moved in the woods, small rustles, snaps of twigs, the sound of something heavy moving far off, then going quiet. It wasn't constant, but it came often enough to keep me turning my head. That evening, as I was sitting inside after dinner, I noticed something odd, a sound that was different, a slow, steady crunching in the distance, like someone walking carefully across gravel or leaves. I froze and listened. At first I thought it could be an animal, but the steps were spaced apart in a way that sounded deliberate. Not fast, not heavy, but steady. Then it stopped. I stood by the window and stared out, but all I saw was my reflection in the glass against the darkness. The sound didn't return, but the feeling it left in me did not go away. I told myself it had to be a deer, or maybe even a bear wandering nearby, though the rhythm of it kept playing in my mind. That night, when I tried to sleep, I had trouble. Every creak of the cabin, every small sound outside, made me open my eyes. I thought I heard faint crunching again sometime after midnight, but I wasn't sure. I pulled the blanket tighter and stayed still until I fell asleep again. On the third day, I was more aware of the woods. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, but it came in waves, strong enough that I would stop and look around, listening hard, only to hear nothing. I decided to stay close to the cabin the entire day. As the sun went down, I prepared a fire again and tried to distract myself with my book. But around 9 at night, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, steady, careful, slow. This time it was closer. My chest tightened, and I put the book down. The sound circled, faint but clear, moving from one side of the cabin to another. I walked quietly to the front window, then the side window, trying to catch a glimpse, but I saw only blackness. The crunching would stop, then start again, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart was hammering. I stayed still, holding my breath. Then the sound moved toward the back of the cabin, near the trail, faded slowly until there was nothing. I didn't sleep well at all that night. Every creak of the wood made me twitch. My ears strained for the sound of steps. Sometimes I thought I heard them. Sometimes I wasn't sure if it was just my mind making patterns. But my body stayed tense until the sun rose. On the fourth day, I started to wonder if coming here alone was a mistake. It was supposed to be peaceful, but now I felt trapped by the silence and the distance from help. I thought about leaving, but part of me felt stubborn. I didn't want to run from shadows and noises. I told myself again and again that it was animals. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, even though the cabin was already secure. The air outside felt heavier than before. The forest seemed to press closer. I lit the fire, turned off the lamps, and tried to rest. Then, just past midnight, I woke to a sound that was not creaking or snapping. It was sharp, the sound of metal, the sound of the door handle moving. My entire body froze. I lay in bed, staring at the darkness of the ceiling, ears straining. The handle turned again, slow, deliberate. Then it stopped. Silence filled the room, but my heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I sat up, moved quietly, and picked up the heavy flashlight from the table beside the bed. I didn't turn it on yet. I stood there in the dark, listening. Then came another sound, the creak of the porch boards outside, as if weight was shifting across them. Whoever it was did not knock. They did not speak. They just stood there. I waited, frozen, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The silence stretched until I almost thought I had imagined it. Then, after what felt like forever, the boards creaked again, lighter this time, moving away from the door. I stayed awake until dawn, every nerve in me burning. When the sun came, I checked the porch. The wood was damp from the morning dew, and in it, faint but clear, were footprints. Human footprints. That was the moment I knew it wasn't animals. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been at my door in the middle of the night, trying the handle, standing there in the dark. I packed my bags as fast as I could. I threw everything into the car without caring how it was arranged. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The road back out of the woods felt longer than when I came in, and I checked my mirror over and over, half expecting to see someone behind me. By the time I reached the main road, I felt air in my lungs again. I drove until I reached service, then pulled over and just sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, shaking. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told the owner what happened, they said no one had ever reported anything like that before. Maybe that was true, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw on the porch. And I know someone was out there in the woods, watching, waiting, walking in circles around that cabin while I sat inside, alone. I had been wanting a quiet place for myself for a long time. I lived in the city most of my life, and the noise of cars, people, sirens, and the constant rush always made me restless. Every time I tried to sleep, there was always some sound that pulled me out of it. I told myself I needed a break, a place away from everything, somewhere far from people, where I could just be alone for a while. That was why I rented the small wooden cabin deep in the forest, far from any towns. The cabin sat near the bottom of a hill, with tall trees surrounding it on all sides. The dirt road leading to it was rough and full of dips, and it took me almost 40 minutes from the main road just to get there. My car had trouble on the rocks and mud, and I almost got stuck once when my tires spun in a soft patch. When I finally reached the clearing, I parked in front of the cabin and just sat for a moment. The woods around me were quiet, only the sound of the wind moving slowly through the branches. It felt so far from everything I was used to. I stepped out of the car and just breathed the air, fresh and clean, with the smell of pine and damp soil. The cabin was small, built from thick logs, with a sloped roof that still had patches of snow clinging to it even though the season had just turned to spring. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and inside it smelled of old wood, dust, and something faint like smoke that must have come from the fireplace. There were only 2 rooms. One main space with a kitchen area, a table, a couch, and a fireplace, and a smaller room in the back with a bed. The windows were single glass panes, and when I tried the lock on the front door, it was just a simple metal latch. I unpacked slowly, putting a few canned foods and supplies in the kitchen and carrying my bag to the bedroom. I had brought a flashlight, matches, batteries, and a small radio in case I couldn't get a phone signal. When I checked, my phone had no bars at all. I wasn't surprised. This was deeper in the woods than I had ever been. At first, the quiet felt nice. I spent the day outside, walking around the cabin, looking at the slope of the hill behind it, and following a narrow trail that disappeared into the trees. The air stayed cool, and the forest was thick, with patches of moss covering rocks and fallen logs. There were animal tracks in the mud near the stream that ran down the hill, mostly deer, maybe a raccoon or 2. That first night, I made a fire in the fireplace and ate a simple meal. The wood popped and cracked, the orange light bouncing on the walls. The cabin felt warm and safe, and for a while I thought I had made the perfect choice. But when the fire burned low and the light dimmed, the darkness around me felt heavier than I expected. The windows showed nothing outside, only black. No streetlights, no cars, no signs of anyone else for miles. Just me inside a wooden box in the middle of nowhere. When I lay in bed, I noticed how thin the walls felt. Every sound outside came through. I could hear branches creaking in the wind, the tapping of something light hitting the roof, and once or twice I thought I heard faint cracks, like twigs snapping under weight. At first, I told myself it was animals. The forest was full of them, and it was normal to hear things. But the more I listened, the more my heart wouldn't settle. I was used to city noises, but these were different. They were sharp, sudden, and without warning. I didn't sleep much that first night. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went for a long walk, following the trail up the hill. The higher I climbed, the more the view opened. I could see valleys below and endless trees stretching out in all directions. No houses, no cabins, no roads, nothing but green and brown. It was beautiful, but also strange knowing I was completely alone. By the second night, I started to notice more. After I put out the fire and lay in bed, I heard what sounded like a soft scrape against the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a branch moving in the wind. But when I listened closer, it seemed slower, like something being dragged. I sat up in the dark, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing. After a while, it stopped and I fell asleep, though not deeply. On the third day, I went down to the stream to fill some water. When I bent down near the mud, I noticed prints. They weren't animal tracks. They looked more like shoe prints, faint but clear enough. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little bigger. They came from the trees and stopped near the water, then turned back. I froze for a while, looking around at the woods. Everything was quiet, no one in sight. I tried to tell myself maybe a hunter or hiker had passed through, but the cabin was far from any marked trail. It didn't make sense. That night, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside felt sharper, closer. The scrape came again, but this time it was on the opposite side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it through the window, but all I saw were trees. My hand shook as I held it, the beam of light bouncing on the glass. I stayed awake almost the whole night, sitting on the bed with the flashlight beside me. On the fourth day, I thought about leaving. The cabin was meant to be an escape, but instead I felt tense, like I was being watched. Still, part of me told myself I was overthinking, that I was just not used to being out here. I spent the day chopping some wood, anything to keep busy, but I kept looking at the edge of the trees, half expecting to see someone there. That night, something changed. I woke up to a thump on the porch, a heavy sound, like weight shifting on the wooden boards. My chest tightened as I lay still, holding my breath. Another thump followed, then the creak of the porch boards. Something or someone was standing just outside my door. I reached slowly for the flashlight and turned it on, pointing it at the window near the door. The light reflected off the glass, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. Something pale just outside, but it disappeared when I blinked. My hand shook harder and I stayed frozen, listening. After a while, the sound stopped. In the morning, I opened the door slowly, and my stomach dropped. There were footprints on the porch. Not boots, not bare feet, but worn shoes, the tread barely visible. They led to the door, then back toward the trees. My chest felt hollow as I followed them a short way, but they faded quickly in the underbrush. I knew then that it wasn't animals. Someone was out there. Someone had come to the cabin in the night and stood right at my door. From that moment, the cabin no longer felt safe. I kept the fire going even during the day, the smoke rising from the chimney, hoping it would scare whoever it was away. But the tracks in the mud showed they came back more than once. Sometimes in the morning, I found new prints circling the cabin, close to the windows. By the sixth day, I hadn't slept more than a few hours total. My eyes felt heavy, my body sore, but my mind was sharp with fear. I thought about leaving, but the long drive down the dirt road felt dangerous too. If someone was watching me, they could follow me. Out here, with no signal and no neighbors, I had no one to call for help. That night, the sounds came again. Scraping, tapping, the boards creaking under weight. I stayed awake with the flashlight, staring at the door. Hours passed, then I heard it. The slow turn of the metal latch on the door. My whole body froze. The latch lifted slightly, then dropped back with a soft clink. Whoever it was had tried to open the door. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I packed my bag as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved everything inside. I didn't care about the food or the extra clothes, I just wanted to leave. When I stepped outside, the air was cold, and the woods were silent. My car sat in the clearing, damp with dew. But as I walked toward it, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the driver's side window, smeared into the condensation, was the print of a hand. Not pressed flat, but dragged downward, as if someone had wiped their fingers slowly across the glass. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The dirt road felt longer than ever, every bump and turn making me glance in the mirror. I half expected to see someone running behind me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the first small town, where I pulled into a gas station and sat in the car, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw how pale I was, dark circles under my eyes from nights without sleep. I never went back to the cabin. I never told the owner what happened, and I left most of my things there. I didn't care. What I knew was simple. Someone had been watching me, walking around the cabin at night, trying the door, touching my car. I didn't know why, and I didn't want to find out. The cabin had been meant to give me peace and quiet, but all it gave me was the closest feeling to real fear I had ever known. And to this day, whenever I see woods stretching out by the road, I think about that handprint on the glass and how I left just in time. I drove up into the mountains late in the afternoon, the road winding higher through tall trees that closed in tighter the deeper I went. I had rented the cabin for a week, wanting to be away from people, away from work, away from the noise that never seemed to end in the city. The cabin sat at the end of a long dirt road, about 2 miles from the nearest paved highway. When I reached it, the sun was already low, sending pale gold light across the clearing that surrounded the place. The cabin looked old but sturdy, built with thick logs and a roof that sagged only a little. There was a small porch with 2 steps leading up, and the clearing itself was silent except for the wind that moved gently through the trees. When I parked the car, I got out and stood for a moment, listening. I didn't hear another car, another person, not even a dog barking in the distance. It felt cut off from everything, like stepping into another time. The air was cooler here than down in the valley. The smell of pine needles and damp earth drifted around me. I carried my bags inside, finding the door unlocked, the key waiting on the table just inside as the rental owner had said it would be. The cabin inside was plain but clean. One main room with a wood stove, a sofa, and a small table. To the left, a narrow kitchen with old but working appliances. To the right, a short hallway led to a small bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were large enough to let in the last of the light, but once the sun went down, I knew the place would be very dark. There were lamps and a few overhead lights, but no television, no Wi-Fi, nothing that would tie me back to normal life. That was the point, I told myself. Just a week away from everything. I unpacked slowly, put food in the refrigerator, set my clothes in the dresser, and then walked back outside before the last of the light was gone. The clearing was surrounded on all sides by thick woods, tall trees pressed close together, their shadows already growing heavy. I walked around the cabin once, looking at the tree line, at the small fire pit near the porch, at the woodpile stacked neatly along the sidewall. The silence was deep, and for the first time in months, I felt both calm and uneasy at once. Calm because there was nothing here to bother me. Uneasy because it was so still that it felt unnatural. When night fell, I lit the wood stove and made a simple meal. I ate at the table, listening to the fire pop and crackle. I could hear the wind moving now and then outside, brushing against the cabin walls. When I stepped outside once more before bed, I found the clearing drowned in darkness. The sky was heavy with clouds, no stars visible. My car was only a few yards away, but it looked swallowed up by the night. I stood there for less than a minute before going back inside and locking the door. The first night passed quietly. I woke once to the sound of branches snapping outside, but I told myself it was just wind or maybe a deer. I pulled the blanket tighter and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and found prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't boot prints. They looked like they came from bare feet, the toes clearly pressed into the soil. I crouched down, staring at them. They were small, not like a grown man's, but not tiny like a child's either. Somewhere in between. The dirt was soft enough from recent rain that the prints were sharp and fresh. They led from the woods toward the side of the cabin, then back into the trees again. I stood up, looking at the tree line. It was silent, no movement, nothing but the wind brushing leaves. I told myself maybe some local kid had wandered out here. Maybe they lived somewhere nearby. But I had seen no houses, no other cabins, not for miles. All day I tried to shake it off. I read for a while, chopped some wood, took a walk along the dirt road, but I kept thinking about those prints. When I came back later, I walked the edge of the clearing, looking again. I found no new prints, but I saw where some of the branches near the tree line were bent, like someone had pushed through recently. That night, I sat longer by the fire, listening. I heard the usual night sounds, wind, the groan of the old cabin settling, but also something else. At one point, I thought I heard a faint rustle just outside, like someone moving slowly through grass. When I looked out the window, the darkness was so complete that I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the glass. I stayed awake until almost 2 a.m, then finally forced myself into bed. The second morning, more prints were there, this time closer to the cabin, right beneath the window of the kitchen. My stomach dropped when I saw them. The prints were clear in the damp soil, and they hadn't been there the day before. Whoever it was had been standing right outside while I was inside. I checked the doors and windows again. All were locked, nothing broken. I stood for a long time at the window, staring out into the woods, my skin prickling. The next days dragged on, each one pulling tighter at my nerves. I never saw anyone, but the prints kept appearing. Some nights, I heard light scraping against the cabin wall. Other nights, I swore I heard breathing outside the bedroom window, faint but steady. I started leaving lights on through the night, though it did nothing to ease the feeling that I was being watched. Each morning, I found the prints, Sometimes they circled the cabin. Sometimes they stopped right at the porch. Once, I found one single print directly on the bottom step, as if someone had placed their foot there deliberately, leaving the mark for me to find. By the fifth night, I was barely sleeping. My body stayed tense, my ears straining at every sound. The stove burned low, casting the room in dull orange light. Just after midnight, I heard it, the slow creak of the porch step. I froze. The sound was soft but unmistakable. Then silence. No knock, no more creaks. Just the step, then nothing. I sat there gripping the armrest of the chair, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the room itself. I stayed that way for an hour until the fire burned almost out. When I finally moved, it was only to add more wood and sit again, waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, I opened the door and looked. On the porch step was another bare footprint, pressed perfectly into the wood's thin layer of dust. My breath shook as I looked at it. It was no larger than my own foot. Whoever it was had been standing just inches from the door. I thought about leaving then, just getting into the car and driving back down to the valley. But some part of me didn't want to give in, didn't want to abandon the place after only a few days. I told myself maybe it was nothing serious, maybe some local person messing with me, maybe just a drifter passing through. I kept trying to make excuses, but deep down I knew it wasn't random. Whoever it was kept coming back. They knew I was here and they wanted me to know they were here too. On the sixth night, it got worse. I had stacked a chair against the front door, more for my own peace of mind than anything else. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a sharp sound, like something hard striking the side of the cabin. Then silence. Then again louder, a dull thud against the logs. I lay frozen, staring into the dark. Another thud, then scraping. Slow, deliberate scraping along the wall, moving toward the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The scraping stopped right beneath the glass. Then came the faintest tap, tap, tap against it. My chest tightened. Whoever it was stood there in the dark, tapping on the glass while I lay only feet away. I stayed like that until the first light of morning crept in. When I finally got up, I found fresh prints all around the cabin. I also found something worse. On the outside of the bedroom window, smudged into the glass by a dirty hand, were streaks. Fingers had dragged down the glass, leaving long marks like they wanted me to see them. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags as quickly as I could, shoving everything into the car. My hands shook as I loaded up. The woods were silent again, but I felt eyes on me the entire time. Before I left, I looked once more at the cabin. On the porch step, in the dust, was another fresh footprint. Right in the center, facing the door. I drove down the dirt road fast, the car jolting and bouncing, branches scraping against the sides. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to the valley, not slowing until I saw other cars, other people, normal life moving again around me. I never went back for the rest of that week. I left the key in the drop box at the rental office, not saying anything, not asking for a refund. I didn't want to explain, didn't want anyone to think I was making it up. But I knew what had happened. Someone had been out there, night after night, circling the cabin, watching me, standing right at the windows, leaving their prints as if to remind me I wasn't alone. They never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves. But they were there. And the thought that stayed with me, the one that makes my stomach twist even now, is that they only stopped because I left. If I had stayed just one more night, I don't think I would have left at all. I decided to spend a week in an old cabin deep in the woods that belonged to a friend of a friend. It wasn't fancy or modern, just a plain wooden cabin tucked far back from the main road, sitting close to a small lake. I wanted the time away from everything, no phone service, no internet, no noise, no people. I thought it would be perfect for clearing my head. When I first arrived, I noticed how quiet it was. The gravel road leading in was narrow and rough, lined with tall trees on both sides. The cabin itself looked worn but still solid. The front porch sagged a little and the paint had long faded, but the roof seemed good and the door closed firm. Around the place were thick trees that blocked most of the view of the sky, but there was a little path leading down to the water. I could hear the lake through the trees, lapping gently against the shore. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood and dust. It had one main room with a wood stove, a little table, and a bed frame with an old mattress. A small kitchen area sat in the corner, with a sink that ran only cold water from a hand pump. There was no electricity, just a couple of oil lamps and candles. The bathroom was nothing more than an outhouse behind the cabin. The first day felt peaceful. I unloaded my food and gear, stacked some firewood by the stove, and walked the area to get used to it. The path to the lake was narrow and a little overgrown, but it led down to a small dock. The lake itself stretched wide, bordered by forest on all sides. The water was calm, and the air was cool. Standing there, I thought it was exactly what I needed. That night, I lit a lamp and sat at the table writing in a notebook. The woods outside were silent except for the occasional chirp of a cricket or the faint call of an owl. I went to bed early and listened to the stove crackle until I drifted off. The second day, I explored farther. I followed an old trail behind the cabin that climbed a ridge. From up there, I could see the lake better, shining between the trees. I spent most of the day walking, listening to the woods, and just being alone. When I got back to the cabin, I cooked a simple meal and sat on the porch until the light faded. That night, though, something felt different. Lying in bed, I heard a noise outside. It wasn't the soft rustle of wind or the usual forest sounds. It was heavier, like footsteps in the dirt. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon wandering by, but the steps seemed slow, almost careful. I stayed still in the bed, holding my breath. After a while, they faded away into the distance, and I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I went out to check around. The ground was soft in some places, and I noticed prints near the side of the cabin. At first, I thought they were boot prints, but I wasn't sure. They looked like they could be from an animal, maybe a bear standing upright. The shape wasn't clear. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but all through the day, I kept thinking about it. Every time I walked the woods, I found myself glancing behind me. I stayed closer to the cabin that day, chopping some wood and keeping busy. That night, the noises came again. This time, I heard them circling the cabin. Slow steps, pausing now and then. My chest tightened as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I kept the stove low so the firelight barely glowed. I thought about getting up and peeking out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to know someone was inside. After a long time, the sounds drifted away again. When morning came, I stepped outside and checked. There were definitely prints this time, and they were boots. The size looked large, maybe a man's. They circled around the cabin and led off toward the trees. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an animal passing by. Someone had been walking around the place in the night. I thought about leaving right then, but the road was long, and I had no phone service. My car was parked back down near the gravel turnoff, not close by the cabin. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just some hunter passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watching the cabin, watching me. That day, I stayed near the lake. I kept checking the woods, scanning for movement. Everything seemed quiet, but too quiet. I felt like the trees themselves were holding something back. I barely ate and kept my pack ready in case I had to leave in a hurry. By nightfall, I felt exhausted but too wound up to sleep. I left the lamps off and sat in the dark, listening. Hours dragged by. Then I heard it again. Slow steps. They came from the back of the cabin, near the outhouse. Then along the wall, stopping by the window. I held my breath, clutching the handle of the hatchet I had kept near me. The steps lingered there, and I could almost sense someone standing just outside, trying to hear if I was awake. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but I couldn't be sure. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away into the trees again. I barely slept. In the morning, I forced myself to pack some of my things. I thought about making the walk back to the car, but something inside me worried I'd run right into whoever it was out there. I decided to wait until midday when the sun was high and then go. I sat on the porch as the hours passed. The woods were dead quiet. Around noon, I grabbed my pack and started down the path. My eyes kept darting left and right, scanning the trees. Every crack of a branch made me freeze. The path felt longer than before. Halfway to the car, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the side of the trail, nailed to a tree, was a torn piece of fabric. It looked like it had come from a shirt, weathered but not too old. Below it, in the dirt, were clear boot prints leading toward the same trail I was on. I turned around fast, heart pounding, and hurried back toward the cabin. It felt safer to be inside with a lock on the door than out in the open woods with someone following me. Back at the cabin, I shut the door, slid the latch, and sat with my back against it. My hands were shaking. The thought kept circling in my head. Someone knew I was there. Someone had been around the cabin at night, circling, waiting, and now I had proof they were still nearby. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. The steps came again, louder this time, circling closer. I heard the porch creak. The door latch rattled once, slow and deliberate. My chest felt like it would burst. I held the hatchet tight, every muscle frozen. After a long moment, the rattling stopped. The steps faded, but I knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, maybe just out of sight. When morning came, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I gathered everything fast, stuffed it in my pack, and left. I didn't care about food or clothes, just what I needed to get out. I stepped into the woods, forcing myself to walk steady even though every sound made me want to run. The trail to the car felt endless. I kept glancing behind me, sure I'd see someone. Branches snapped somewhere off to the side. But I didn't stop. My throat was dry, and sweat ran down my back. When I finally saw the clearing where my car sat, I almost cried with relief. But then I froze again. In the dirt near the car were fresh boot prints. They led right up to the driver's side door and circled around. My keys were in my pocket. My hands shook so bad I could barely get them out. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. The sound of it roared in the quiet woods. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the gravel road, not daring to look back. The trees whipped by, and the cabin disappeared behind me. I drove until I hit the main road, not slowing until I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never found out who it was. Maybe some drifter, maybe a hunter, maybe someone who lived in those woods and didn't want me there. All I knew was that they had walked around that cabin night after night, circling, waiting, and watching. And I had been inside, listening, too scared to move. I never went back to that cabin again. I drove for hours that day, the road stretching out endlessly through thick woods and empty fields, the kind of places where you start to feel the world shrink down until it's just you, the road, and whatever waits at the end of it. I had rented a small cabin up in the hills, something that was supposed to be quiet, away from noise and people. I had been tired of constant pressure back home, always working, always busy, never really alone. I told myself a week away in a cabin would fix things, that it would let me breathe again. The place had no internet, no phone service unless I drove down into town, and the nearest neighbor was about 4 miles away. It sounded perfect when I booked it, exactly what I wanted. The cabin sat off a long dirt road, tucked behind tall pines and brush, so hidden you could drive past the small turnoff and never even know it was there. When I first pulled in, I noticed how quiet it was. No cars, no distant hum of anything, just trees swaying lightly in the wind and the faint sound of water somewhere downhill. The air smelled sharp, like pine needles and damp soil. I remember feeling relaxed as I unpacked my things. There was a small porch with a rocking chair, a single room inside with a bed, a wood stove, a little table, and a kitchenette that looked old but functional. The windows were dusty but big, letting in a good amount of light. It was simple but comfortable, exactly how I imagined a place like that should be. The first day was calm. I set my bags down, stacked some firewood I found beside the cabin, and walked a short distance to get used to the place. There was a narrow trail running behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the land. When I got back, I made a small fire inside, heated a pan of canned food, and sat listening to the crackle of the wood. felt peaceful, almost too quiet, but at the time I liked it. That night, I slept deeply. The second day, I woke up earlier than usual. The cabin didn't have curtains thick enough to block out the sun, so the light crept in quickly. I made coffee on the small gas burner and sat on the porch watching the trees. Nothing unusual happened. I spent most of that day reading, writing in a notebook, and taking a short hike. Toward evening, I noticed the woods seemed darker than they had the night before. It wasn't just the light fading, but the shadows themselves felt heavier, stretching longer across the ground. I told myself it was only because of the thick trees. That night, I sat by the fire again, this time letting the flames burn longer. I thought I heard something in the distance while I was eating. At first it sounded like branches snapping, but I figured it could be deer moving through the brush. It was common for animals to move at night in such areas. Still, I remember pausing, holding my fork in the air, and just listening. The sound stopped, and after a few minutes I convinced myself it was nothing. I went to bed, though I didn't fall asleep as easily as the night before. On the third morning, I woke up to find tracks in the dirt not far from the cabin. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but as I looked closer, I realized they were human. Bare feet, pressed into the soft soil, moving in a wide path around the cabin before vanishing back into the woods. My stomach sank when I saw them. They were fresh, made sometime during the night after I had already gone to bed. I stood there staring at them, my mind searching for excuses. Maybe it was old, maybe someone from before. But the edges were sharp, not yet blurred by wind or time. Whoever had made them had been here very recently. I walked back inside the cabin and locked the door, even though the lock was just a simple metal latch. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe they passed through and kept going. But the prints circled the cabin like someone had been walking around, studying it. That didn't sit well with me. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't want to go down the trail or wander too far. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, I tensed. When evening came, I built the fire higher than before. I kept telling myself it was fine, but a knot had formed in my stomach that wouldn't go away. That night was worse. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up at every sound. The cabin creaked as it cooled, wood popping softly in the stove, but every noise seemed sharper, heavier, like it carried more meaning. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside again. A light shuffle of steps, faint but steady, moving across leaves. My heart pounded, and I held my breath, lying there in the dark. The sound paused, then picked up again before fading. I didn't dare look out the window. I stayed still until the exhaustion finally forced me into sleep. The fourth morning, I checked outside again. This time, I found more tracks. They weren't just around the cabin. They led up onto the porch, right near the door. The dirt there was scuffed, as though someone had stood for a while. My chest tightened as I looked at it. Whoever it was hadn't gone away. They had come closer. I suddenly realized how far I was from anyone else, how isolated this cabin really was. No cell signal, no quick way to call for help. It was just me out there, with someone I didn't know moving around at night. That day, I carried a heavy branch with me whenever I stepped outside, something solid enough to use if I had to. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The woods felt different now, less peaceful, more like they were hiding something. I barely ate that day, my stomach too tight with worry. When night came again, I felt dread building as the sun went down. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and sat near the fire with the branch beside me. The cabin felt smaller, the walls thinner. Every sound outside made me jump. Hours dragged on, and then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They crunched softly over the ground, closer this time. I froze, staring at the door. The steps stopped just outside. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear faint breathing beyond the wood, steady and controlled. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, and then I heard the light scrape of a hand dragging across the door. I gripped the branch so tightly my hands ached. After a long time, the sound moved away, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there in silence, the fire dying low, my eyes fixed on the door. When daylight came, I opened it cautiously. More prints marked the dirt, clear as day. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin again, just like before. By the 5th day, I knew I couldn't relax there any longer. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was too far to walk and I had little gas left in the car. I decided to wait one more night, then head out in the morning. That whole day, I barely stepped outside. I packed most of my things, kept the branch beside me, and sat watching the windows. Every tick of the clock felt like it dragged slower. That final night was the worst. As the fire burned low, I heard the sounds again, but this time there were more of them. Not just one set of footsteps, but several, moving lightly around the cabin. My heart hammered as I listened. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow move across the thin curtain of the window. I sat frozen in place, unable to move. The steps lingered, circling slowly, like they were testing me, waiting. Hours stretched on, and finally, near dawn, the sounds faded once more. When the sun rose, I grabbed my bags, threw them in the car, and left without looking back. I drove fast down the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel, eyes darting to the mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached the small gas station miles away. Only then did I finally breathe properly. I never found out who it was or why they had been there. No one followed me, no one tried to stop me as I left. It was like they had only wanted to remind me how vulnerable I was out there, alone in that cabin. I never went back, and I never will. To this day, I can still remember the sound of those footsteps outside the cabin door, steady and patient, as if they had all the time in the world. I never thought much about being alone in the woods until I found myself in the middle of it, inside an old cabin that was supposed to be a place of peace and quiet. I had rented it out for a week, far away from the noise of town and the constant pull of work, thinking the silence would do me some good. The cabin sat on a small rise, with trees pressing in from every side, the forest thick and heavy with pine, oak, and brush that seemed endless in every direction. When I first got there, I thought it was perfect. The dirt road leading in was narrow, rutted, and rough, making me feel like I was leaving everything behind as I drove up. The cabin was plain and small, built from weathered logs that had darkened over years of rain and sun. The roof slanted low and the porch sagged just enough to creak under my boots. The front door was a heavy wooden thing that took a hard push to close. Inside, the air was still and smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and the faint hint of damp earth that clung to places like this. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked a few things, set up the small kitchen with the supplies I had brought, and walked around the property. Behind the cabin was a narrow path that wound into the woods. It didn't look well used, just a faint track where the ground was packed a little firmer than the rest. I followed it for a short while, listening to the crunch of leaves and sticks under my boots and the constant rustle of branches overhead. The air smelled sharp and clean, and I felt calm. By evening, I lit a small fire in the fireplace and sat with a book, listening to the crackle of the flames. Outside, the forest grew darker and heavier, the trees blending into one solid wall of black. When I stepped onto the porch, I couldn't see much beyond a few feet, the woods swallowing up everything beyond that. The silence was deep, so heavy that it pressed on my ears. I thought I heard a snap of a branch in the distance, but I brushed it off as just the normal sound of animals moving through the woods. The first night was fine, though the silence made it hard to sleep at first. I wasn't used to lying in bed without the faint hum of cars or the distant sounds of life somewhere beyond my walls. Out here, there was nothing but the faint creak of the cabin, the wind moving through the trees, and the occasional cry of some bird or animal in the distance. Eventually, I drifted off, though I woke several times, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. Each time, the cabin was still and silent, and I told myself it was just my mind adjusting. The second day I spent exploring more. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, carrying a small pack with water and some food. The trees stretched endlessly, and the trail wound in unpredictable ways, sometimes fading almost completely before picking up again. I lost track of time and distance, but eventually, I turned back, uneasy about straying too far. When I came out of the woods and saw the cabin again, sitting small and lonely in its clearing, I felt both relief and unease. Relief that I wasn't lost, unease at how small and fragile it seemed compared to the heavy, endless woods pressing in around it. That evening, as I was making a small meal, I heard something outside, a sound that was not the normal rustle of animals. It was faint at first, like a light crunch on gravel or dried leaves, steady and deliberate. I froze, listening hard. After a moment, it stopped. I waited, standing still in the kitchen, straining my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but something about the rhythm of the steps stuck with me. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The cabin creaked now and then, the wood settling as the air cooled, but I couldn't shake the thought of those steps. At one point, I thought I heard them again, outside near the porch. Slow, careful steps on wood. I held my breath, listening. Then silence. The silence stretched on until I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The third day, I checked around the cabin carefully. The ground was soft in places, covered in pine needles and damp soil. I thought I saw a faint impression near the edge of the clearing, like where a boot had pressed into the dirt, but I couldn't be sure. Could have been anything. Still, I felt unsettled. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, gathering some kindling, straightening up the cabin, reading. But my mind kept going back to the night before, to the sound of steps on the porch. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. The cabin was remote, and I had chosen it partly for that reason. The thought of someone else out there watching made me uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. That night, I made sure the door was locked and the windows were latched. I even stacked a chair under the doorknob, though I knew the heavy door would be hard enough to force open as it was. Still, the act made me feel a little safer. I lay in bed, the fire dying down to faint glowing embers. The cabin was dark, shadows stretching long and heavy across the walls. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke again, heart pounding, unsure why. Then I heard it, the slow creak of wood, the sound of weight shifting on the porch. My mouth went dry as I stared at the ceiling. The sound came again, 2 steps, then silence. Whoever it was, they weren't moving quickly. They were careful, deliberate. I lay frozen, every muscle tense. After a long moment, there was a soft scrape, like a hand brushing against the wooden siding. Then nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and endless. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I was on edge. I checked the porch, the ground around the cabin, but found nothing clear. A few scuffs on the wood, maybe, but that could have been from me. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was several miles away, and I had planned for a week here. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that I had let my imagination run wild in the silence of the woods. But that night, it happened again. The steps, slow, steady, circling the cabin this time. I heard them move along the side, then fade toward the back. My chest tightened as I lay still in the dark, listening. The sound stopped for long stretches, then started again, always careful, always slow. At one point, I heard the faint rattle of a window latch, just once, then silence. My whole body was rigid, my heart hammering so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. I stayed like that until dawn, my nerves stretched raw. When the first light filtered through the trees, I forced myself to move. I checked every window, every door, all still locked. But near the back of the cabin, just under the window, I found it clear in the damp soil. A footprint, human, a boot larger than mine, fresh. I can keep going with the story in the same detail, expanding it until it passes 7,000 words. It'll cover multiple nights of growing tension, survival tactics, traps set, food running low, a direct confrontation, and finally, a clear, realistic ending where the narrator escapes or gets caught. I had been planning the cabin trip for a while, wanting to spend a few days alone in the quiet of the woods. The idea had been to escape the noise of the city, the constant messages and calls, and to see how it would feel to be completely cut off from everything. The cabin I chose was old, small, and far away from the nearest town. It sat in the middle of thick forest with no neighbors nearby. The road to it was a narrow dirt track that curved deep into the trees. I had to drive slow because of the loose gravel and broken branches, and even then, the car shook hard over the ruts. When I finally parked in front of the cabin, the silence hit me right away. No traffic, no voices, no buzzing electronics. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird. The cabin itself was a single-floor wooden place with a porch. The paint had worn off, the windows looked cloudy, and the steps creaked under my boots when I climbed them. I had rented it cheap, and now I understood why. It wasn't the type of place people came to for luxury. It was for being alone, and that was what I wanted. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The air smelled like old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust. There was one main room with a bed, a small kitchen space, a table, and an old wood stove in the corner. The floorboards sagged in places, and the furniture looked like it had been sitting there for decades. There was no electricity, only a lantern and a box of candles on the table. The water came from a hand pump outside. I set my bags down and unpacked slowly, wanting to get a feel of the place. The bed had a thin mattress with faded sheets. The cupboards in the kitchen were almost empty except for some old cans left behind, which I didn't plan on touching. I had brought my own food, a cooler filled with meat, bread, and water. After unpacking, I lit a candle and sat at the table just listening. The quiet was heavy, like a weight pressing in from all sides. The first day was simple. I walked around the area, stretched my legs after the drive, and explored the woods near the cabin. The trees were tall, blocking most of the sky, and the ground was covered in thick layers of leaves. I followed a small trail down to a stream and filled my bottle there, the water cold and fresh. By the time I returned, the light was starting to fade. I cooked a small meal on the portable stove I brought, ate in silence, and read a book by candlelight. When it was fully dark, I lay on the bed listening to the forest outside. The sounds at night were different. The creak of branches, the movement of animals, and the occasional sudden snap of something heavy stepping on wood. At first, I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I wanted to believe it was normal, but it didn't feel normal. The noises weren't just distant. Sometimes they came close, too close. More than once I thought I heard the crunch of footsteps right outside the walls of the cabin. I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I would wake again, staring into the darkness of the room, holding my breath, waiting. The old wood of the cabin made small cracking sounds as it cooled, which didn't help. By morning, my body felt heavy, my head sore from not resting properly. I shook it off, telling myself it was part of being in a place like this. I spent the day chopping some wood with the small axe outside, filling buckets of water, and walking further down the trail. But even in daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would stop and turn, staring back down the path, but there was never anything there, just trees and more trees. That night, the noises were worse. The sound of something brushing against the walls, the scrape of wood, and once what felt like a thump directly against the side of the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay still, listening. I thought about looking outside, but the idea of opening the door to the darkness made my skin crawl. I stayed in bed, gripping the blanket, eyes wide open until dawn. The third day, I felt drained. I tried to keep busy, but everything seemed harder. My hands shook when I chopped wood. I couldn't focus on reading. I sat on the porch with a bottle of water, staring into the forest, listening. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shadow shifting quickly, too fast to be sure. That night, I barricaded the door with the table and chair. It was childish maybe, but it made me feel a little safer. The sounds came again, heavier this time. I was sure it was footsteps, slow, steady, circling. The boards under my bed creaked as I tried not to move. My throat was dry, my palms slick with sweat. Then came a sound like fingers dragging along the wooden wall outside, long and deliberate. My whole body went cold. I knew then that it wasn't animals. Animals didn't move like that, didn't drag their hands on walls, didn't circle in slow measured steps. This was someone out there. Morning light came like relief. I checked outside and saw nothing, but the dirt near the porch had faint impressions. Not clear footprints, but something pressed into the ground. My heart pounded as I stared at them. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything and driving away, but pride or stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was imagining too much, that it was probably a hunter or hiker passing by. The fourth night broke me. The noises started early, before it was even fully dark. The crunch of leaves closer this time, then a scrape at the window. I froze, staring at the glass, but it was too dark to see anything. I pulled the blanket up, not because it would help, but because it was the only thing I could do. Hours dragged on, every sound magnified in the silence. At one point, I was certain I heard breathing outside the wall near my bed. Slow, steady, human breathing. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I packed my bags fast, hardly stopping to eat. When I carried them outside, I felt the hair rise on my arms. There were clear footprints in the dirt this time. Bare feet, larger than mine, pressed deep into the mud around the cabin. They circled the walls and stopped right at the front steps. I threw everything in the car and started the engine. The relief of the motor roaring to life was overwhelming. I backed up fast, the tires sliding on the dirt, then drove down the narrow road without looking back. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. I didn't slow down until I reached the main paved road miles away. When I finally pulled over, my whole body was trembling. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, staring at the trees in the distance. There was no denying it anymore. Someone had been out there every night, circling, watching, waiting. I would never know who it was or what they wanted, but I knew I had been right to leave. If I had stayed one more night, I wasn't sure I would have made it out. I drove up to the cabin later in the afternoon, the kind of late summer day where the air still carried warmth, but the shade of the trees already felt cool and damp. The road into the forest was rough and narrow, the gravel worn down with patches of dirt that had been carved by rain over the years. The sound of my tires crunching over the rocks was the only thing breaking the silence around me. I had rented the cabin for a week to get away from everything, thinking I would enjoy the stillness, maybe do some writing, some reading, and just be away from the noise of the city. The cabin itself was tucked deep into the woods, a simple wooden structure with a small porch and a sloped roof that looked like it had taken a beating over the years. When I pulled up, I saw the place was more run down than the pictures had suggested. The wood was darker, weathered from rain and sun. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the steps creaked when I tested them with my foot. The front windows were streaked with dirt, and spider webs stretched in the corners. Still, it had a kind of quiet charm, and I told myself it would feel cozier once I was inside. The inside smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and something earthy that came from the forest itself. The floorboards were uneven, and my footsteps echoed as I carried in my bags. There was a small kitchen with a rusty sink and shelves that leaned slightly, a living space with an old couch that had stuffing poking out at one corner, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The bedroom was just a small square with a narrow bed and a dresser. The bathroom had running water, though the pipes made a groaning noise when I turned the faucet. I unloaded my things slowly, getting a feel for the place. The air was still inside, as if no one had opened the windows for weeks. When I pulled one up, the frame stuck, and I had to push hard to get it unstuck. A gust of fresh air swept in, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. Outside, the forest stretched thick and endless, trees packed tight together with undergrowth that looked hard to push through. The first hours were quiet. I sat out on the porch with a book, listening to the occasional call of a bird, the rustle of branches when the breeze picked up. But as the light began to fade, a heaviness seemed to settle over everything. The forest grew darker faster than I expected, the trees blotting out the last of the sunlight. By the time the sky was still faintly glowing above the treetops, the ground around the cabin was already dark. That first night, I cooked a small meal on the gas stove and sat in the living room with just a lantern for light. The silence pressed in, heavier now, broken only by the faint creaks of the cabin as it cooled down in the night air. I told myself it was just old wood adjusting, the same way houses groan sometimes. But I noticed every sound. A faint snap outside, like a twig breaking, a low rustle in the brush. Once or twice I thought I heard something heavier, like footsteps, but each time I convinced myself it was just an animal. Deer moved quietly but not silently, and raccoons or foxes could easily make noises like that. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The mattress was thin, the sheets smelled faintly musty, and every creak of the cabin kept my eyes open. At one point in the night, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall, a slow scraping sound that seemed to move along the boards. I lay still, listening hard, my heart thudding against my ribs. After a minute, it stopped. I waited longer, the silence stretching out, before I finally let my eyes close again. The next morning, I checked outside, half expecting to see claw marks or something unusual, but the walls looked normal, just weathered wood and peeling paint. I brushed it off and tried to settle into the day. I walked a little down one of the trails that led from the cabin, though the paths were barely visible, just faint tracks in the dirt with weeds pushing through. The woods were thick, and I didn't go far, not wanting to lose sight of the cabin. Back at the cabin, I tried to write, but my mind kept drifting. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful, like the trees were holding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was more isolated than I had expected. There was no cell signal at all, no sound of distant cars or planes, just the thick, steady quiet of the woods. By the second night, the unease grew sharper. As I sat with the lantern on, I heard the same scraping against the wall again. This time it was slower, more deliberate. My breath caught as I listened, trying to place it. It sounded close, right against the wood near the bedroom. I forced myself not to move, staring at the wall as if I could see through it. The scraping paused, then started again, lower to the ground this time. I stayed awake for hours, listening until it stopped. The next morning, I found something odd. In the dirt near the side of the cabin, there were faint impressions, not clear footprints but areas where the ground had been pressed down. They were too large to be from a raccoon or fox, too irregular to be shoe prints. I crouched there for a long time, trying to make sense of them, but the longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. The days blurred after that, each one carrying the same unease. At night, the scraping and rustling returned. Sometimes it sounded like light tapping, as if fingers or something like them were testing the wood. Other times it was heavier, like weight pressing against the wall. I barely slept, lying rigid in bed, straining my ears. In the mornings, I checked outside, but the marks in the dirt were always faint, never clear enough to prove anything. By the fifth day, exhaustion weighed on me. My nerves were frayed, every sound jolting me upright. I thought about leaving, but the road back was rough, and I had told myself I'd last the week. I didn't want to admit that fear was driving me away. Still, I couldn't ignore how wrong things felt. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark, hoping maybe the silence would settle differently if I wasn't casting light. But instead, the noises were sharper. I heard the soft crunch of leaves outside, moving slowly around the cabin. My chest tightened as I followed the sound, imagining something circling me. Then came the scrape, right against the window this time, faint but unmistakable. My skin went cold. I stayed still, barely breathing, until the noise drifted away. When dawn came, I packed. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into my bag, not caring how I folded them. I loaded the car as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. The forest was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed the dirt by the porch, clearer this time. Impressions, wide and uneven, pressed into the soil like something had crouched there, waiting. I drove out fast, the gravel spitting under my tires, not looking back until the trees finally broke and the road widened. My chest loosened only when I saw the open sky again. I never went back to that cabin. I never even checked if it was still being rented. I told myself it was just my imagination, just exhaustion and the weight of being alone in the woods. But the truth is, I know what I heard. I know how the walls shook, how the ground was pressed down. Something was out there, close enough to touch the walls where I slept, close enough to leave marks just outside the door. That week taught me something about silence, about how it isn't empty. Sometimes it hides things. Sometimes it presses in until you feel it breathing with you. And when I think back to those nights in the cabin, what stays with me most isn't the sounds themselves, but the pauses between them, the waiting, the listening, the way it always seemed just on the other side of the wall. I had rented the cabin with the idea that it would give me some quiet time away from the city. I wanted a week without cars, without people talking around me all the time, without the constant pressure of phones ringing and screens flashing. The place had been advertised as simple but comfortable, sitting by itself near the edge of a lake, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. It was the kind of cabin people usually went to during summer with family, but now it was early autumn. The nights had already started to get colder, and most people were finished with vacations. That was one reason I got it for cheap. The other reason was its isolation. The closest paved road was about 6 miles away, connected by a rough dirt track that wound through hills and trees. When I first got there, the air felt different. The forest seemed thicker than I had expected, with trees crowding close on both sides of the narrow track. The dirt road had been rutted from rain, and when I pulled my car up near the cabin, I could already feel how hard it might be to leave again if heavy weather came. The cabin itself looked older than in the pictures online. The paint had peeled away in spots, and the front steps sagged. Still, the roof seemed solid, the chimney stood straight, and the small deck looked like it could still hold weight. There was a shed a little farther behind the cabin, half hidden by trees, with its door tilted slightly open. Inside, the place smelled of wood, dust, and the faint dampness that settles into buildings left closed too long. There was one main room with a small kitchen at one end and a fireplace at the other. A short hallway led to a bathroom and 2 small bedrooms. The furniture was simple: an old sofa, a wooden table with chairs, and a few shelves. There was no TV, no internet, no phone service. That had been one of the selling points for me, but when I actually stood there alone with no bars on my phone, I realized just how disconnected the place really was. The first day passed quietly. I carried my food and bags inside, made sure the windows closed properly, stacked some of the firewood from the shed, and got myself settled. By evening, the forest grew darker than I expected. The trees pressed in on all sides, and when the sun dropped behind the hills, the shadows seemed to fall quickly and completely. The only sounds were wind in the branches and the occasional creak of the cabin's walls as they cooled. I sat by the fire that night, listening to it pop, thinking it was exactly the quiet I had wanted. It was the second night when I started noticing things that unsettled me. That day had been gray and chilly. I spent the morning walking near the lake and then came back to chop some of the larger logs into smaller pieces. By the time it got dark, I was tired and ready to sit by the fire again. The night seemed even quieter than before, so still that I could hear water dripping from the roof after a short rain shower. Around midnight, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something move outside. It was faint, but enough to catch my attention. A crunching sound, like weight pressing on leaves or twigs. It wasn't steady. It came once, then paused, then again. At first, I told myself it was just some animal moving through the woods. This was thick forest, after all. Deer, raccoons, foxes, anything could be out there. But the steps, if that's what they were, sounded slow. Too slow, like something careful. I lay still, listening hard. The sound faded, then stopped completely. After a long while, I finally drifted to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The ground near the cabin was soft in places, covered in damp leaves. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around to the back, near the shed, I noticed a patch of earth that had been disturbed. The leaves looked pushed aside, like someone had stepped there recently. The mark wasn't clear enough to call a footprint, but it wasn't shaped like an animal track either. I told myself it was nothing. Leaves get blown by wind, branches fall, maybe I was imagining it. That day, I tried to shake it off. I cooked, read, wrote a little in my notebook. But by evening, I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. The forest looked darker than before, the trees almost pressed against the cabin. When I went to bed, I left the fire burning low in the fireplace. I thought maybe a little light would make me feel less unsettled. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something moved outside. I heard the sound of steps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The wood creaked under the weight. My chest tightened as I lay there, every muscle stiff. I waited, barely breathing. The sound moved across the porch, then stopped. A long silence stretched out. I kept staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. If it was an animal, why was it on the porch? If it was a person, why would they be out here in the middle of nowhere, coming to a cabin they didn't own? After what felt like forever, the steps moved again. They crossed the porch, then faded away toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, straining to hear if they came back. They didn't. The next morning, I opened the door and checked. The boards of the porch showed faint scuffs where the dust had been disturbed. Again, not a clear footprint, but enough to prove I hadn't imagined it. By then, the comfort I had felt on the first day was gone. I started locking the door even when I was inside, something I hadn't bothered with at first. I kept the hatchet I'd used to split wood closer, propped near the door. Every sound outside made me tense. The forest, once quiet and peaceful, now seemed alive with hidden movement. That night was worse. I barely slept at all. Every time the cabin creaked, I jolted awake, heart racing. Around 2 a.m, I heard something again. This time it wasn't on the porch. It was at the back of the cabin. A scraping sound like something sliding against the wall. I gripped the hatchet, staring at the dark window. The scraping went on for a while, then stopped. I waited, not daring to move, until eventually exhaustion pulled me into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next day, I checked the back wall. On the wood, near the window of the smaller bedroom, I saw faint marks, lines scratched into the surface. They weren't deep, but they were new, fresh enough to show lighter wood beneath the weathered surface. I ran my hand over them, trying to figure out what had made them. They didn't look like claw marks. They looked like something harder, sharper, maybe metal. My unease turned into dread. Whoever had been outside the cabin wasn't just wandering through the forest. They were coming close, testing, watching. The following nights blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every time I tried to rest, sounds jolted me awake. Sometimes steps, sometimes faint tapping, like fingers on glass. Once, I swore I heard breathing just beyond the window. Every morning I found new signs. Disturbed leaves, faint scuffs on the porch, another scratch on the wood. By the 5th night, I felt like I was unraveling. My food was running low, and I thought about leaving. But the dirt road out was rough, and I feared getting stuck alone. I told myself I could last 2 more days, then drive out in daylight when I felt safer. That night, everything came to a head. It was past midnight when I heard the sound again. Steps on the porch. But this time they didn't move away. They stopped right at the door. I sat frozen, gripping the hatchet so tight my hands hurt. The wood creaked under the weight. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. It rattled against the lock. I felt sweat run down my back. Whoever it was, they were trying to get inside. The knob twisted again, harder. The door shuddered. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of the lock giving way. Then silence. For a long time, nothing moved. Finally, I heard the steps retreat. First across the porch, then down into the leaves, fading toward the trees. I didn't sleep at all. I sat up until dawn, staring at the door, waiting for another attempt. When morning finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. On the porch, near the door, was a clear mark this time. A boot print pressed into the damp wood. I knew then without doubt. It wasn't animals. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been coming to the cabin night after night, watching, testing, trying to get in. That morning, I packed everything I could into the car. I didn't care if the road was rough, if I had to abandon things, if I risked getting stuck. I wasn't staying another night. When I finally drove away, bumping down the rutted dirt track with the cabin shrinking behind me, I felt the tightness in my chest begin to ease. By the time I reached the paved road, I was exhausted, but the relief was overwhelming. I didn't look back. The cabin had been everything I thought I wanted: quiet, isolated, far from people. But by the end of that week, I understood something I hadn't before. Isolation cuts both ways. The same distance that keeps others away also keeps you from help when you need it most. Out there in the woods, I wasn't just alone. I was vulnerable, and someone had known that. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, away from people, away from traffic, away from everything. The cabin was small and simple, the kind of place built for hunters and fishermen. It had a single room with a little kitchen space, an old wooden table, a bed pushed up against the far wall, and a wood stove that sat in the corner with a pipe running out through the roof. The wood was stacked along the outside wall, cut and split, ready for use. There was no electricity, no phone signal, no running water except for a hand pump a few yards outside the door. When I first arrived, the air smelled like pine and damp soil. The forest was thick all around, tall trees with branches that blocked much of the sun, and the ground was covered in layers of dead needles, leaves, and roots that twisted out of the dirt like veins. The drive to get there had been rough, a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for my car, with deep ruts filled with rainwater and low branches scraping against the roof. By the time I parked and carried my bags inside, I was already sweating. The cabin felt cool and dark when I stepped in, and it took a little time for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent my time chopping smaller pieces of wood, sweeping dust out of corners, walking short trails near the cabin, and cooking simple meals on a little propane burner I had brought with me. At night, the silence was heavy. No cars, no voices, no faraway sounds of towns or highways. Just wind in the trees, the creak of old wood settling, and sometimes the sharp snap of branches breaking somewhere out in the dark. I was not used to that kind of quiet, and at times it felt more like a weight pressing against me than a comfort. On the third night, I woke to a sound that didn't fit with the normal noises I had grown used to. It wasn't the random knock of a branch falling or the sigh of the wind. It was steady, deliberate, a crunch of leaves and twigs under footsteps. At first I thought maybe it was a deer moving through the woods, but the rhythm was too slow, too careful. Animals usually walked in uneven patterns, quick pauses followed by sudden movement. This was different. This was the sound of someone trying not to be heard, but still heavy enough that the forest floor gave them away. I lay in bed, not moving, just listening. The sound circled the cabin, fading at times, then coming closer again. I could almost picture someone moving slowly just outside the walls, testing the ground, trying to see without being seen. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed like that for a long time, staring at the ceiling, until the steps drifted away and finally disappeared into the distance. When morning came, I went outside and checked the dirt around the cabin. The ground was uneven with roots and pine needles, not the best for holding clear prints, but I thought I saw a few places where the soil had been pressed down in shapes that could have been from boots. That whole day I couldn't shake the unease. Every sound from the forest seemed sharper, like it carried a hidden meaning. When I went to pump water, I kept turning my head, checking the trees. When I chopped wood, I found myself stopping to listen every few minutes, half expecting to hear those same steps again. Nothing came, but the feeling never left. That night, I couldn't fall asleep easily. I kept staring at the cracks between the boards where thin strips of moonlight slipped through, and every creak of the cabin set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Soft, slow, deliberate steps moving closer. I could tell they were on the far side of the cabin at first, then shifting toward the front. I had locked the door earlier with a heavy bolt, but I still felt the urge to get up and push something against it. My hands shook as I dragged the wooden table quietly across the floor and pressed it up against the door. The steps paused for a long time after that, then moved again, this time around the back. I lay on the bed with my ears straining until they were gone. When daylight came, I decided to check again. I circled the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. This time there was no doubt. In the softer dirt near the pump, there were clear boot prints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, deeper. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving that day, packing everything into the car and driving back down the rough road to the main highway, but I convinced myself maybe it was just a hunter passing by. Maybe they had been curious about the cabin and walked around. The prints could have been old. Still, I carried a heavy feeling with me that didn't go away. The next night was worse. I had barely managed to fall asleep when I woke to a scratching sound on the wall. Faint but steady, like something dragging lightly along the wood. I held my breath, listening. The scratching moved slowly across one side of the cabin, then stopped. Then I heard breathing. It was faint, but in the silence of that place, it was unmistakable. Someone was standing right outside the wall, breathing steady and deep. My whole body went rigid. I wanted to get up, to grab something heavy to defend myself, but I couldn't make myself move. Minutes passed like hours. The breathing stopped, the scratching started again, and then came the sound of the steps moving away. I waited, frozen in place, until I was sure they were gone. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. The following morning, I decided to set up a small trap of sorts. I gathered a few tin cans from my supplies and tied them together with string. I set them near the door and around the windows so that if anyone came close, they might knock into them and make noise. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, the cans clattered. The sound jolted me awake, and I grabbed the axe I kept near the stove. My hands gripped the handle so tight they hurt. I could hear footsteps running away after the noise, crashing through the undergrowth this time, not careful or slow like before. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to trip the cans. The fear became a constant thing after that. During the day, I tried to stay busy, but every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me. At night, I barely slept. The sounds came again and again. Footsteps, scratching, the faint knock of something against the cabin walls. Once I heard the pump handle move outside, squeaking as if someone tested it. Another time I woke to see a shadow pass across the sliver of moonlight shining in through the small window. I counted the days until I planned to leave, but each day stretched out endlessly. I kept thinking I should pack and drive out early, but the road back was rough, and if my car broke down out there, I would be worse off. So I stayed, waiting, watching, surviving each night until morning. The last night was the worst. I had stacked the cans again, set the table against the door, kept the axe beside the bed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the cans toppling, louder than before. Then the door rattled, hard, as if someone was testing the bolt. My heart hammered. I gripped the axe and stared at the door, ready for it to give way. The rattling stopped, but then the sound of wood splintering came from one of the windows. I turned and saw a shape pressing against the glass, trying to force it open. I felt panic rise in my throat, but I forced myself to move. I shouted, slammed the flat of the axe head against the stove, making a deep ringing sound. The shape froze for a moment, then backed away. I heard heavy footsteps pounding away into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark with the axe in my hands, waiting for daylight. When the first gray light of morning seeped into the cracks, I packed everything as fast as I could, loaded the car, and drove out. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole time, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway hours later. When I finally looked back in the rearview mirror, the trees closing in behind me, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Whoever had been out there had wanted something, maybe just to scare me, maybe worse. I never saw them clearly, never knew who they were or why they had circled my cabin night after night. But I knew one thing with certainty. If I had stayed even one more night, they might not have left again. That cabin, once just a quiet place in the woods, became something else in my mind. Not a refuge, not a retreat, but a trap I had barely escaped, and I knew I would never go back. I drove out to the cabin on a late afternoon in early fall, when the air was sharp and cool, the kind that makes you breathe deeper just because it feels cleaner. The road had been long and winding, and by the time I turned off onto the dirt track that led deeper into the trees, the sun was already dipping low, giving everything that strange golden color. Dust rose behind the tires and hung there like smoke. The forest around me looked endless, tall pines and bare branches mixed together, shadows already crawling between them. The cabin had been built a long time ago. Nothing fancy, just wooden planks darkened with age and a roof that looked like it had seen decades of winters. I had come here because I wanted to spend some time alone. No phone service, no noise, just me, the trees, and quiet. I carried in supplies earlier in the week, so all I had to bring now was a backpack with clothes, a flashlight, some batteries, and a cooler in the trunk with enough food for days. When I parked in front of the cabin, I sat for a moment in the car before stepping out. The woods had that silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing on you. I unloaded what I needed, locked the car, and walked up the few creaking steps to the porch. Inside, the place smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The air was cooler inside than outside. The floorboards bent under my steps, and I could hear the faint scratching of mice in the walls. I set my things down on the small table by the window and opened the shutters to let in what light was left. The view from there was endless trees, the dirt road winding back out of sight. I could just barely see the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. I had seen it many times before, but that evening it looked different, almost too still, as if the world beyond the clearing had paused. The first few hours went quietly. I stacked some firewood by the stove, lit a small fire, and cooked a simple meal on a cast iron pan. The sound of sizzling food filled the place, mixed with the occasional crack of wood burning. I ate slowly, watching the light fade outside until the trees were nothing more than black outlines. By then, the cabin was the only thing lit, the fire giving off a warm glow that made the shadows stretch long across the walls. Night fell heavy, the kind of night you only get far from towns, where the dark is so complete it feels like it swallows the cabin whole. I stepped out onto the porch with a lantern just to feel the air. It was colder than I expected, and my breath came out in clouds. The lantern barely pushed the dark back, and the forest looked endless, each tree a black pillar, each gap between them a deeper shadow. The silence wasn't perfect anymore. I could hear faint movements out there, small cracks of branches, maybe animals, maybe wind, but I couldn't tell. I didn't stay out long. I shut the door behind me, bolted it, and checked the windows twice. Inside, the fire had burned lower, and I added another log before lying down on the old cot pushed against the far wall. It was lumpy, and the springs creaked every time I shifted, but it would do. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there with my eyes open, I heard it again. A faint crunching noise, like footsteps on gravel, except softer, slower, the kind of noise that makes you hold your breath. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for it again, and sure enough, it came. Closer this time, just outside the cabin walls. I sat up carefully, not wanting the cot to groan too loud. The fire had burned down almost completely, so the room was dim, the faintest red glow left in the stove. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and switched it on, the beam cutting through the dark. My heart was pounding, and I told myself it was just a deer, maybe even a raccoon nosing around for scraps. But the sound of the steps didn't match that. They were too deliberate, too heavy for something small. I stood still by the window, listening. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow, steady, as if someone was circling. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, fighting the urge to turn it off so I wouldn't be seen. Then it stopped completely. The silence after it was worse than the sound itself, like waiting for something you can't predict. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. I finally forced myself back onto the cot, leaving the flashlight beside me, still on. I kept my boots on just in case. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone standing just outside the wall, waiting. The morning light eventually came, gray and thin through the window. I stepped outside right away, half expecting to see footprints. The ground was covered with a thin layer of leaves, damp from dew, and I scanned every inch of it. I thought maybe I was overreacting until I noticed one spot near the edge of the clearing. The leaves there were disturbed, pressed down in a way that looked too neat to be from an animal. It looked like someone had stood there for a while, facing the cabin. The rest of the day, I tried to shake it off. I kept busy, chopping some wood, walking a short distance into the trees, just enough to get a sense of my surroundings. But the thought of someone being out there stayed with me. Every time I looked between the trees, I expected to see movement. By late afternoon, I decided to check the road, just to reassure myself. I followed it for a while, but it was empty, no tire marks besides my own, no sign of people. Still, the woods pressed in around me, and I didn't like the feeling of having my back turned. I hurried back before the sun dropped too low. That night, I built the fire higher, trying to push the shadows back as much as I could. I even pulled the table in front of the door as a barrier. It made me feel a little better, even though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. I lay down again, flashlight in hand, the beam aimed at the ceiling. I didn't have to wait long this time. The noise came back, same slow steps, but heavier. I heard the crunch of leaves, then a faint scrape against the wall, like a hand brushing the wood. My throat went dry. I sat up, every muscle tense, listening as the sound moved along the wall, closer to the door. The table pressed against the door gave me a strange kind of comfort, but it also made me realize something. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. They were testing the place. The footsteps stopped at the porch. I could hear the faint creak of a board under weight. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. Then came the softest sound of pressure against the door. Not a knock, just a push. The bolt held, the table didn't move, and after a long, dragging pause, the weight eased. The steps moved away again, slowly, until I couldn't hear them. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the flashlight beam fixed on the door, fire burning low again. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Sure enough, there were fresh marks in the dirt, footprints this time, unmistakable. Large, heavier than mine, leading from the trees to the cabin and then back into the forest. I didn't feel safe anymore. Every plan I had of staying the week here was gone. I started packing my things, shoving clothes into the backpack, loading up the cooler. I had no idea who was out there or why they were watching the cabin, but I wasn't going to stay and find out. When I stepped outside to load the car, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far side of the clearing, just at the tree line, a fresh mark in the bark of a tree. It wasn't natural. It looked like it had been carved with a knife, a straight vertical line, deliberate. I scanned the trees around it, but they were still. Whoever had made it could have been watching me right then, hidden somewhere between the trunks. I didn't waste more time. I threw the last of my things in the car, started the engine, and turned down the dirt road, not looking back. My hands were tight on the wheel the whole way, every bend making me feel like someone could step out in front of me. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me, until the trees thinned and the world felt normal again. But even then, the thought wouldn't leave me. Someone had been out there, circling the cabin at night, watching, testing the door. And if I hadn't left, I don't know how much longer they would have just watched. I've thought about it many times since. The cabin still stands there, silent in its clearing, far from anyone. Whoever it was could still be in those woods, waiting for the next person to spend the night, someone who doesn't leave when the footsteps begin. That's why I will never go back. I had been looking forward to getting away for weeks. Work had been draining me, and I wanted nothing more than to be alone somewhere quiet, far from noise, traffic, and people. I rented a small cabin tucked into the woods, about an hour from the nearest town. The listing described it as basic but comfortable, with no internet and poor cell service. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for entertainment or connection. I wanted silence. The cabin was small, made of old wood, and sat at the end of a long gravel path that wound through thick trees. When I first pulled up, I noticed how isolated it was. I couldn't see another house or building anywhere nearby. The trees crowded the clearing on all sides, tall and heavy, their branches leaning over like they were pressing down on the place. There was one dirt path leading back toward the main road, and when I looked down it after parking, I could no longer see where it curved out of sight. I carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and something older, like dried wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, but it felt worn, like it had been sitting empty most of the time. The furniture was plain. A small couch, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the single bedroom. There was no television, no computer, no modern decorations. Just bare walls and simple things. The kitchen had only a few utensils, an old stove, and a fridge that hummed quietly when plugged in. The first night was calm. I made myself something simple to eat and sat on the porch as the sun dropped low behind the trees. The forest grew dark quickly, shadows stacking on top of each other until the trees looked like a wall. I listened to insects buzzing and the occasional call of a bird, and later, when it was fully dark, the sound of frogs down by some water I couldn't see. I felt relaxed for the first time in weeks, even though the silence was heavier than I was used to. When I finally went inside and turned off the lights, the darkness filled the cabin completely. The next day, I took a walk down the gravel road and into the woods. The air was cool, and the sky was gray with a light mist that clung to the tops of the trees. I didn't go too far, just enough to get a sense of the area. The woods were dense, with lots of fallen branches, uneven ground, and thick undergrowth. It felt easy to get lost, so I made sure I always kept the road in sight. By the time I came back to the cabin, I was damp with sweat and ready to rest. The first 2 days passed without anything unusual. I read books I had brought with me, cooked simple meals, and slept deeply in the quiet. But on the third night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, just enough to pull me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. I lay still in the dark, listening. The sound came again, a creak, like wood under weight. I knew the cabin made noises as it settled, but this was different. It had a rhythm to it. It sounded like footsteps. My heart beat hard in my chest as I lay frozen on the bed. I strained to hear more. After a few seconds, there was another creak, and then silence. The cabin was so quiet that even my breathing seemed too loud. I told myself it was nothing, just the wood adjusting in the cool night air. I closed my eyes and forced myself to stay calm. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though it was light and restless. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and convinced myself that the noises had been in my head. The day was normal again. I walked, I read, I sat outside. But when night came, I couldn't relax the same way. I kept looking toward the windows, half expecting to see something outside. That night, I locked the door and double-checked the windows before going to bed. I left a small lamp on in the corner of the room. Around midnight, I woke again. This time it was clearer, the sound of the door handle moving. I held my breath and listened. The handle rattled gently, like someone was testing it, slow and careful. The cabin was small. The door was only a few feet from where I slept. I stared at the dark shape of it across the room, my body frozen stiff. The handle stopped moving, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I stayed awake until the first light of morning showed through the window. When I finally opened the door, I saw nothing unusual. No footprints on the porch, no marks on the handle. Still, the feeling stayed with me. Someone had been there. I couldn't prove it, but I knew what I had heard. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every sound in the woods felt closer, sharper. The rustling of leaves, the crack of branches, all of it made me tense. I kept checking the road, half expecting to see someone walking up. But no one came. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lamp on and sat up in bed, staring at the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was the sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and heavy, circling. I held my breath as the steps moved from the porch to the side of the cabin. Then they stopped. For a long time, nothing. Then, a soft tap against the window. Just one. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the window, but the lamp only lit part of the room, leaving the glass in shadow. I could not see outside. After a while, the sound stopped, and everything went silent again. When morning came, I checked the window. No marks. The ground outside was covered in leaves, so I couldn't see footprints. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was an hour away, and I had already paid for the week. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe my mind was making things worse than they were. Still, I couldn't relax. I spent the next day on edge, checking the road, checking the windows, jumping at every sound. As night came again, my stomach knotted with dread. That night, it was worse. I woke up to the sound of the door handle turning harder, rattling like someone was frustrated it wouldn't open. Then silence. Then the sound of slow breathing just outside the door. Deep, steady breaths. My body went cold all over. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. Then I heard footsteps moving away, crunching through leaves, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up with my back against the wall, staring at the door until the sun came up. In the morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, shoving clothes into my bag, not caring if I folded them. I was about to load them into my car when I stopped. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a single boot print. Large, clear, pressed into the dirt where the wood ended. My chest tightened. Someone had been there. It wasn't in my head. I rushed to my car and threw my bags inside. My hands shook as I tried to start the engine. The gravel crunched loud under the tires as I pulled away, the trees closing in on both sides as I drove down the narrow road. I didn't look back. I kept driving until I reached the main road, and then farther until I saw the town ahead. Only then did I finally breathe easier. The cabin had seemed quiet, safe, and lonely when I first arrived, but I left knowing that someone else had been watching me there, moving in the dark outside, testing the door, waiting. If I had stayed one more night, I don't know what would have happened. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks, trying to find some quiet time away from everything. The small wooden place sat deep in the woods, far from town, about an hour's drive down a dirt road that most cars would not even bother to take. I wanted to be alone, away from noise, away from the steady pressure of people and schedules. I had food, water, a generator, some tools, and more than enough to keep me comfortable for a few days. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would clear my head. When I first arrived, the sun was still high in the sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine. The cabin looked rough from the outside. Old wood, small windows, a tin roof that had dark stains running down the sides. The porch creaked under my boots when I stepped onto it. The front door was stiff, but it opened with enough force. Inside, it was quiet. Just the soft hum of the generator out back and the dry smell of wood that had been sitting for years. I walked through each room, checking things. A living space with a couch and a table, a small kitchen with a rusty sink, a back room with a bed that sagged in the middle. It was nothing fancy, but it was fine. I dropped my bags and went back out to unload the rest from the truck. By late afternoon, I had everything inside. I stacked food in the kitchen, set my flashlight and knives where I could find them quickly, made sure my cell phone had at least some service even if it was weak. I didn't plan to use it much. The forest around me was still heavy with the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you're not. I tried not to think about that. As the first night came, I settled in. I cooked some canned food on the small gas stove, ate slowly, and listened. The woods had a way of sounding alive at night, with small cracks of branches and the faint scurrying of animals. I expected that. It was normal, but as the hours dragged on, something about the quiet shifted. I noticed it when I was brushing my teeth in the small bathroom. The sounds outside were gone. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of anything. Just dead silence. I paused, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, foam dripping slightly. I set the brush down and stepped softly back into the main room. I stood still. The generator hummed low behind the cabin, but besides that, nothing. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I walked to the window and looked out. The trees stood motionless, black shapes against a dark sky. The moon was hidden. I thought maybe a predator was moving nearby, something that scared off the smaller animals. But then I saw something else. The ground near the tree line looked disturbed. The dirt there seemed darker, not from shadow, but from something like fresh movement, like someone had walked along the edge of the trees. I squinted, leaning closer to the glass, trying to see detail. I told myself it was probably deer or something wandering. Still, the silence made it feel wrong. I pulled the curtains shut and sat back on the couch. My knife was on the table. I kept glancing at it without meaning to. Hours went by and I barely slept. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground by the trees did have tracks, but not animal tracks. They were boot prints clear in the dirt. They circled the cabin. I walked slowly along them, following the trail. The prints came up to the porch, stopped near the door, then looped around the back. My stomach tightened as I traced them. Someone had walked here in the night while I was inside. I checked the truck. The doors were still locked. Nothing seemed touched. I checked the generator, the gas cans, everything was still there. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything. They had just been there, watching, maybe. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some hunter or someone wandering the woods. But the cabin was far from anywhere. It was unlikely someone had just stumbled by. That whole second day, I couldn't relax. Every time the trees swayed in the breeze, I kept looking out. I checked the doors twice, then 3 times. I made sure my knife was always within reach. When night came again, I kept the lantern low and tried to stay quiet. Around midnight, I heard it. The soft crunch of leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. Someone walking outside. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, toward the back. My hand gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped just outside the wall near the bedroom. I held my breath, listening. Then came the sound of the porch creaking, slow weight shifting on the boards. Whoever it was right outside the door. My throat was dry, my chest tight. I thought about the gun I didn't bring, wishing I had it now. Minutes dragged. The boards creaked again, lighter this time, then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, never moving from the couch, knife ready in my hand. When the sun came, I opened the door carefully. The dirt showed fresh prints again. They had come to the porch just like before and walked around the cabin, circling slowly. I decided then I couldn't stay long, but I also couldn't leave just yet. The truck had half a tank and the gas cans were still full, but the road out was rough. If someone blocked it, I'd be trapped. I told myself I'd wait one more night, then leave in daylight. The third night was worse. The woods were silent again, heavy, pressing silence. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting. Hours went by, my eyes straining at the shapes of the windows. Then, around 2 in the morning, I heard the faintest scrape at the back window. Not tapping, not knocking, just the sound of something dragging lightly across the glass. My body went cold. I stayed still, barely breathing. The scrape moved slowly, like a finger across the pane. Then it stopped. The silence after was unbearable, stretching long and heavy. I thought I saw a shadow shift outside, but I wasn't sure. By dawn, my nerves were raw. I packed everything fast, tossing food and tools into bags without care. I carried them to the truck, eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. The tracks were there again, circling, overlapping the old ones. I climbed in the truck and started it. The engine roared loud in the still morning. I backed up quick and started down the dirt road. My hands shook on the wheel, my eyes flicking to the mirrors constantly. The road wound through trees, narrow and rough. Every branch looked like movement. Every shadow felt like it hid someone. I drove fast, tires bumping over rocks, dust rising behind me. Halfway down, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, facing the road. Tall, still too far to see details, but close enough to know it was a man. He didn't move as I passed, just stood there watching. I didn't slow down. I pressed harder on the gas, bouncing along until the cabin was far behind me and the trees thinned out. When I finally hit pavement again, I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to town without looking back. I never went to that cabin again. Weeks later, I thought about it more. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't stolen anything. They just circled night after night, watching, letting me know they were there. It wasn't an accident. They wanted me to feel it, to know I wasn't alone. That thought has stayed with me since. Not knowing who they were, not knowing what they wanted, just knowing someone was out there, moving in the dark around my cabin, standing still in the trees, waiting. And that was enough to make me never want to go back. I never thought I would spend a night alone in a place like that, but sometimes the way life turns forces you into situations you never really planned for. The cabin sat deep in the woods, further from the main road than I had expected when I first agreed to use it. A friend of mine had mentioned it months earlier, saying it was a quiet place for people who wanted to disconnect from everything for a while. He had used it during hunting season, and since it was empty most of the year, he said I could stay there if I wanted some time alone. At the time, it had sounded like a decent idea, even appealing, but when I finally made the trip and pulled my car into the small dirt clearing where the structure sat, I felt something different settle in me. The cabin was smaller than I pictured. It had one narrow porch with 2 old wooden steps leading up to the door. The wood was weathered gray, cracked in places, and the roof sagged a little at the edges. The trees around it grew close and thick, pressing in so much that only a thin strip of sky could be seen overhead. No other buildings were anywhere nearby, no lights, no signs of people, just endless trees and a silence that felt heavier than what I was used to. I got out of my car and stood for a while, listening. The sound of the engine cooling down ticked in the still air. Aside from a distant crow and the faint rustling of leaves high up, everything was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you notice every little sound your own body made. The shuffle of shoes on dirt, the zip of a jacket, even your breathing seemed too loud. Unlocking the cabin door was harder than it should have been. The key my friend gave me stuck in the lock, and the knob squeaked as I forced it open. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood hit me first. The place had clearly been sitting and used for a while. The front room was simple, just a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. A small shelf with some cooking pots leaned against the far wall. There was a narrow hallway leading to one small bedroom and a bathroom that I quickly realized only had a bucket system and no real plumbing. I told myself I could handle that. It was just for a couple of nights. After bringing in my bag and locking the car, I set up the basics. I put my food on the counter, unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed since the mattress looked old and sagging, and checked that the flashlight I brought worked. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, nothing modern, just 4 walls, a roof, and the woods pressing in. At first it felt almost calming. I made some coffee on a small propane burner I brought and sat on the porch with the cup in my hand. The air was cool, the woods were green and endless, and there was a strange kind of peace in being so far from anyone else. For a while I could almost forget how far out I was. But as the day stretched on, the feeling of peace thinned. The woods around the cabin were so dense that the sunlight faded quicker than I expected. By late afternoon, it already felt dim. The shadows from the trees grew long, and the silence deepened in a way that set me on edge. I kept glancing toward the tree line without knowing why. I tried to shake it off by chopping some firewood from a small stack near the shed. The sound of the axe was sharp in the air, and for a few moments it felt good to make noise, like I was reminding the woods I was there. But even then, between the echoes of the strikes, I thought I heard faint cracks of branches deeper in the trees, like something was moving there. Each time I paused to listen, the sound was gone. By the time the sun dipped and the light drained completely, I had already decided I would stay inside for the rest of the night. I cooked a quick meal on the burner, ate it without much thought, and double-checked that the door was locked. The single window in the front room had no curtain, and I found myself avoiding looking out of it. Beyond the glass was just blackness, and the thought of staring too long into it unsettled me. Inside the cabin, every sound became amplified. The wood creaked as it settled. The wind moved through the trees outside and sometimes made the roof groan. I lay on the bed with my flashlight nearby, trying to read a book, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the door, then the window, then back to the dark hallway. It wasn't just nerves, at least not entirely. After about an hour of lying there, I heard something outside. At first it was faint, a soft crunch like footsteps on leaves. I froze, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A deliberate step, then another. The cabin was so small that every sound outside felt magnified. I sat up slowly, trying not to make the bed creak, and grabbed the flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I aimed the light at the window, but all it showed was the reflection of the beam against the glass. I switched it off quickly, realizing the light might make me more visible than whatever was out there. For several long minutes, I sat in silence, straining my ears. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, anything normal. But the steps I heard had weight to them. They weren't scattered or quick. They sounded careful. The night dragged on like that. I dozed for short stretches, only to wake at every sound. The knock of a branch against the roof, the crack of something in the brush, even the wind pressing against the walls. At one point, just past midnight, I woke to the faint sound of the door rattling. Not loud, not forceful, just the handle shaking like someone testing it. I held completely still, my throat dry, staring at the dark shape of the door until my eyes watered. It stopped after a few seconds, but I didn't sleep again after that. The hours crawled until morning finally came. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked harmless again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the ground was scattered with fresh pine needles from the night wind. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I checked the dirt around the porch steps, I saw them. Footprints, not animal tracks. Shoes. The prints were faint but clear enough in the loose soil. They circled the cabin, stopping near the window, then the door, then heading back toward the trees. My chest tightened as I followed them with my eyes, watching them vanish into the shadows of the woods. I stood there for a long time, gripping the porch railing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone lost. But who walks right up to a cabin in the middle of the night, circles it, rattles the door, and leaves without a word? The thought of packing up and leaving crossed my mind, but pride or stubbornness made me stay. I told myself it was just one night, maybe nothing serious, and I had come all this way for some quiet. I would stay one more night, then leave in the morning. That decision was the worst mistake I made. The second night was worse in every way. I'll never forget it. I had rented the cabin with the thought that it would give me some peace away from the noise of the city. It was a small wooden place tucked deep in the trees, about an hour's drive down a narrow dirt road from the last paved stretch. The cabin sat by itself with nothing but woods and hills around. The nearest house was miles away, and the nearest little store was almost half an hour down the road. I had wanted quiet, a place where I could rest my head without hearing traffic or people. And that is what I thought I had found when I booked it. When I first got there, I was struck by how empty it felt. The gravel driveway led up to the front, and when I stepped out of the car, I could hear nothing except the faint rustling of leaves above me and the distant sound of water somewhere far away. The cabin was simple, one floor, made of dark wood, and had a small covered porch with a single rocking chair. There was a stack of chopped logs leaning against the side, and the front steps creaked when I walked up them. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and dust. The floorboards were worn, the furniture plain, but it felt solid. There was a main room with a small couch and a wood stove, a kitchen off to the side with just enough space for one person to move comfortably, and a single bedroom tucked at the back with a window that looked out toward the woods. The bathroom was small, just a sink, toilet, and shower. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I wanted. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked some of my things, filled the small fridge with groceries I had brought, and set some wood in the stove when the evening grew cold. The silence was heavier than what I was used to, but it didn't bother me. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the crickets, watching the shadows deepen in the trees. It was darker than I had expected when the sun dropped. Out here, with no streetlights, no glow from houses or cars, the woods swallowed everything. The only light came from the moon, but even that only cut through the branches in pieces. That night, I locked the front door, checked the back window, and settled into bed. I told myself it was safe, even though the quiet was sharp enough that every creak in the wood made me pause. I reminded myself that it was only the old boards cooling down, only the wind pressing against the cabin. I eventually drifted off, though it was restless sleep. The second day, I went for a walk down one of the dirt trails near the cabin. The woods were thick and damp, and the ground was uneven with roots. I didn't go too far because I wasn't familiar with the area and didn't want to risk getting turned around. I came back, made myself something to eat, and spent most of the afternoon reading inside. It was calm, but the sense of isolation had begun to settle heavier in me. That night, as I was trying to sleep, I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like a crunch in the leaves. I froze in bed, listening, staring at the dark ceiling. My heart was thudding, but after a few minutes the sound didn't come again. I tried to dismiss it as an animal. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer. They moved through woods like these all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I checked the front lock again, then forced myself back into bed. By the third night, I was starting to feel nervous in ways I hadn't expected. It was one thing to be alone out there in the daylight, but at night the cabin felt like a box sitting in the middle of endless dark. The walls seemed thin. The windows felt too open. I went to bed later than usual, waiting until I was too tired to fight sleep. Somewhere after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't the creak of wood this time. It wasn't the wind. It was distinct footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps, one after the other across the boards outside my front door. My whole body tensed. I lay completely still in bed, every muscle tight. The bedroom window was cracked open slightly for air, and I could hear the sound clear through the night. I told myself maybe it was an animal, but these were not animal movements. They were deliberate. The boards creaked in the same pattern a person would make, moving slowly, testing the weight of each step. Then I heard the faint rattle of the front door handle. Cold spread through my chest. I couldn't move at first. I just lay there, listening, my breath shallow. The rattle stopped, and the boards creaked again, as if whoever was out there shifted their weight. Then silence. Minutes passed. I strained to hear anything else, but there was nothing. I sat up slowly, every sound in the cabin amplified. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the stove cooling. I forced myself to walk quietly to the front room. My heart pounded so hard it made my arms feel weak. The front door was closed, the lock still turned. I didn't see anything through the window. I stood there for a long time, staring, expecting to see movement. Nothing came. Eventually, I went back to the bedroom but left the light on. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I went outside to check. The porch boards were scuffed with dirt that hadn't been there before, like someone with boots had walked across them. The driveway had faint tire marks that weren't mine. I stood there in the morning quiet, the chill running deeper than the air. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving, but the rental was paid for, and I told myself maybe it was just some local who had come up out of curiosity, maybe even by mistake. Still, the unease never left me that day. I stayed inside mostly, keeping the blinds drawn, checking the locks more often than I wanted to admit. That night, I set a chair under the front doorknob, something to make noise if it moved. I kept a heavy flashlight by my bed, gripping it like a weapon as I lay awake. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke again to a sound. This time it was at the back of the cabin. A faint tap against the glass of the bedroom window. My heart jumped into my throat. I lay frozen, staring at the dark outline of the window. Another tap came, deliberate like a fingernail against the glass. I sat up slowly, clutching the flashlight. I didn't want to shine it right away because I didn't know what I would see. My skin crawled. Whoever it was, they were right outside the thin wall of glass. The tapping stopped, replaced by the faint scrape of movement along the wall. I imagined someone running their hand along the side of the cabin, feeling their way around. The sound moved toward the back door, then faded. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my bag and shoved what I could inside. I didn't care about the rest. I wasn't going to stay another night. The sky outside was still dark, but I didn't care. I turned on every light as I went, checking windows, forcing myself to move even though my body felt stiff with fear. When I opened the front door, the chair shifted and scraped across the floor. I froze again, listening before stepping onto the porch. The air was cold, the woods black and still. I unlocked the car as quietly as I could, got inside, and started it. The sound of the engine was deafening in the silence. As I pulled out of the driveway, my headlights swept across the trees, and for the briefest second I thought I saw movement, the shape of a person slipping behind the thick trunks. I pressed harder on the gas, the gravel kicking under the tires. The drive out felt endless. Every turn of the narrow dirt road seemed like it would never end, but finally I saw the faint glow of the main road ahead. When I reached it, I didn't stop. I drove until the sun started rising, until the woods were far behind me. I never went back for the rest of my things. The owner called later to ask why I had left so suddenly, and I just said I had to cut my trip short. I didn't explain. I didn't want to. Even now, I think about those footsteps, that rattle of the door handle, that deliberate tapping on the glass. Someone had come out there in the middle of the night, miles away from anyone else, and they weren't there by accident. They had wanted in, and I know if I had stayed one more night, they might have found a way.